Hey everyone. Welcome back to No Harry. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if every magical creature in Britain felt Harry's pain at age 4 and United Army destroyed Dumbledore's power? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The night everything listened. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive was exactly 31 inches wide and 54 inches long. Harry Potter knew this because he had measured it with his body, arms stretched, toes pointed, the way other children might measure a swimming pool or a garden. This was his world. He knew every crack in the plaster, every splinter in the wood, every pipe that groaned when someone upstairs ran the bath. He was 4 years old and he had a fever of 103. It had started 2 days ago, after Uncle Vernon had locked him in here for breaking a plate. He hadn't meant to. His hands were wet from washing up and the plate had simply leapt from his fingers the way things sometimes did when he was scared or tired. The plate had actually reassembled itself on the floor, which had made Uncle Vernon's face go through about 6 different shades of purple before settling on the darkest one. The cupboard. 3 days. No dinner. That had been Tuesday. Now it was Thursday and the fever had come in like a tide, and Harry lay on his thin mattress with his knees pulled to his chest and his glasses, one lens cracked, folded beside his head because even their small weight hurt his face. His whole body hurt. The kind of hurt that made everything feel too loud and too bright even in the dark, even in the quiet. He wasn't crying, exactly. He'd stopped doing that properly about a year ago, after he'd figured out that crying made Uncle Vernon angrier and made Aunt Petunia's mouth go thin in a way that meant more chores, not comfort. But his eyes were wet, and his breath kept hitching in a way he couldn't quite control, and the sound that came out of him, soft, involuntary, barely even a sound, was the kind of thing that a child makes when they've given up expecting anyone to hear. The magic, though. The magic heard everything. It lived in him the way a river lives in a riverbed, always moving, always pressing, always finding the lowest point and flowing toward it. When he was happy, it sparked off his skin like static. When he was angry, it slammed doors and shattered bulbs and once, memorably, catastrophically, turned Dudley's birthday cake entirely blue before anyone had touched it. But when he was like this, when he was small and sick and frightened and alone, it did something different. It broadcast. He didn't know it was happening. He couldn't have known. He was 4 years old and he had no language for the thing living inside him. But the signal went out just after midnight, when the fever spiked and he pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the cupboard wall and made that small, broken, hitching sound into the dark. It moved outward in concentric rings, the way a stone dropped in still water moves outward, except that water only carries the ripple across its surface, and what Harry sent out traveled through the earth, through the air, through the invisible ley lines that had run beneath Britain since before the Romans came and paved over them without knowing. It moved through Wiltshire and Oxfordshire. It crossed the Severn somewhere around Tewkesbury. It climbed north through the Midlands, through the borders, into Scotland. It crossed the sea in both directions and startled something ancient sleeping in the waters off the Orkneys, which turned over once in the deep dark and then went still again, listening. Every magical creature in Britain felt it. Not all of them understood it. A family of bowtruckles in the New Forest simply froze where they were, clinging to their tree with their tiny fingers, heads cocked. A colony of nifflers in a Shropshire borough woke simultaneously, which had never happened before in recorded niffler history, and sat blinking at each other with their long snouts twitching. A kelpie in a loch somewhere north of Inverness surfaced fully for the first time in 11 years and looked south. But the ones who understood it, the old ones, the ones who had lived long enough to have a framework for what the signal meant, those ones moved. Sable felt it in her wings. She was young for a Thestral, barely 40 years old, which is roughly adolescent by Thestral reckoning, and she'd been dozing in the upper branches of an oak on the edge of the forbidden forest when the cry hit her. Not the branches. The upper branches. Thestrals preferred height. It made the humans nervous, which Thestrals found satisfying. The sensation was immediate and physical, like a hand pressing hard against her chest. She spread her wings before she was fully awake, black membrane snapping taut in the cold November air, and she was airborne before conscious thought caught up with instinct. She circled the forest once, twice, reading the direction in the way her kind read everything, in echoes, in the spaces between sounds, in what was absent. South. Southeast. A long way. She went. She was fast in the way that Thestrals are always fast, not streamlined fast like a hippogriff, but shadow fast, the kind of speed that belongs to things that exist partly in the dark. She flew over the sleeping Midlands without anyone seeing her, without a single set of human eyes tracking her dark shape against the darker sky. Past Birmingham, past Coventry, the orange smear of city light spreading below her like cooling embers. The signal got stronger the further south she flew. It pulsed with the child's heartbeat. She found Privet Drive at 12:47 in the morning. She landed on the roof of number 4 so gently that the tiles didn't shift. Pressed her long face down against the slope of the roof, her white eyes open wide. Below her the house was silent, the humans sleeping, the lights all out, the ridiculous lawn ornament garden casting small shadows in the streetlight. She could hear the child breathing. Through the roof, through the ceiling, through the plaster and the thin wood of the cupboard door, she could hear the labored wet sound of his chest and the small unwilling sounds he kept making. She made a sound back. Low, below human hearing range, a thestral frequency rumble that she directed straight down through the roof. I'm here. I hear you. In the cupboard, Harry Potter's breath hitched differently, not in pain, but in surprise. His eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling in the dark and felt something he had no name for yet, something warm and large and certain pressing through the walls at him from above. He put his palm flat on the ceiling of the cupboard. It was only about 2 feet above his face when he was lying down, and something pressed back. He was still sick. He was still scared. But he fell asleep within 3 minutes, and his sleep was deep and dreamless. Sable stayed on the roof until dawn, cropped against the slope, her wings folded tight, her white eyes open. Watching. In the forbidden forest, Rook was looking at the sky. He was 173 years old, which made him old even by centaur standards, and he had the deep brown-gray coloring of old oak bark and a beard that had been plaited by someone, he couldn't remember who, about 30 years ago and had grown out into something that was now more architectural than decorative. He stood at the edge of the tree line where the forest opened onto the grounds, and he was looking at the stars, and he was very still. The other centaurs called him chieftain, though he'd told them for decades that titles were for creatures who needed them. They called him chieftain anyway. He had stopped arguing. Beside him, young Aldrich, 19 years old, impulsive, always trying to read signs that he wasn't yet skilled enough to interpret, shifted his hooves in the frost. The alignment's wrong, Aldrich said. Sagittarius should be at the 3rd position by now. Something's displaced it. Something hasn't displaced Sagittarius, Rook said, without looking at him. Sagittarius is where it always is. You're reading it wrong. But the signal is not in the stars. Rook finally turned. His eyes were dark amber, the color of old honey, and they were very serious. The signal is in the earth. There's a child crying somewhere in Surrey and the magic in him is old enough to crack stone. He paused. I felt it in my hooves before I felt it in my eyes. That's how you know it's real and not a reading. Aldrich stared at him. A child. In Surrey. Surrey is a disappointment of a place, Rook agreed. And yet. He turned back to the stars. He was calculating something, the way centaurs calculate, not with numbers but with the patient accumulation of observations, the way sediment builds into stone. He had felt signals before. He had felt the birth cry of dragons and the death songs of sea serpents, and once, when he was young and arrogant enough to stand too close, the contained nuclear bright fury of a phoenix choosing to burn. He had never felt anything quite like this. Wake Thornwood, he said. And Cress. No one else. What are we doing? Rook looked at him steadily. We are going to find out who is making that child cry. And then we are going to decide what to do about it. The Goblin Nation's Wardstones network covered all of Britain. It had to. Gringotts maintained enchantments on properties across the country, managed estates and trusts and investments that stretched back centuries, and the Wardstones were how they monitored the health of those enchantments without sending an agent to every address every morning. They were subtle. Most wizards didn't know they existed. That night, at 12:47, 17 Wardstones in the Surrey area registered an anomaly simultaneously. Ragnarok III was not the most senior goblin in the nation. There were older advisors, more powerful bankers, longer-tenured council members. But Ragnarok III had a gift that couldn't be taught, which was that he always woke up when something interesting happened, regardless of the hour, and he always thought about it clearly instead of assuming he already knew what it meant. He was at his desk in Gringotts by 1 in the morning, his nightshirt tucked into his breeches in a way that his secretary Filchblink found highly irregular, scrolling through the Wardstone readings with a magnifying glass and a cup of something hot and black. 17 stones, Filchblink said, standing at a pointed distance. I can count. The epicenter is 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging. I know where it is. Ragnarok set down his magnifying glass and looked at his secretary. Pull the Potter estate file. Filchblink's expression went carefully neutral, the way goblin expressions go carefully neutral when they're doing a great deal of internal calculation. The Potter estate is under the management of, I know who manages it. Pull the file. There was a pause. The Dumbledore Trust arrangement sealed it in 1981. We'd need a vault override to access it without, then get me a vault override. Ragnarok picked up his magnifying glass again. His eyes were very sharp above it. A Potter child is at that address. The wards we placed in 1979 at James Potter's specific request, wards he paid for, which means they belong to the Potter estate, which means access is our institutional right, those wards just went critical. I want to know why, and I want to know now, and I want to know what Dumbledore thought he was doing putting a Potter heir in Surrey. Filchblink left at speed. Ragnarok turned back to his ward readings. On the parchment, the 17 simultaneous spikes sat in neat rows, each one spiking identically at 12 hours 47 minutes and 23 seconds, each one then declining to an elevated baseline rather than returning to normal. Like an alarm that had been heard but not answered. Like a child crying long enough to fall asleep from exhaustion. Ragnarok pulled a fresh piece of parchment toward him and began a list. He wrote carefully, in gobbledygook, in the old formal style used for matters of institutional significance. At the top, he wrote a phrase that translated, loosely, as, things that will need to be addressed before they become problems we no longer have the power to address. Below it, he wrote, 1. Harry James Potter. Age 4. Number 4, Privet Drive. Then he sat back and thought for a long while. There were others. A runespore in a private collection in Devon whose 3 heads all turned south in unison. A community of merpeople under the Thames estuary who surfaced in the brackish water and looked toward Surrey with their pale eyes. An elderly unicorn in the New Forest who walked the entire length of her territory in 2 hours, back and forth, unable to settle. A sphinx in magical storage in London who hadn't spoken in 8 years who said, to the astonished overnight security guard, a single complete sentence, the child lives, but the cage is real. The overnight security guard wrote this down and then stared at it for a long time. A family of house elves bound to an old estate in the Cotswolds woke simultaneously, clutching each other in the dark, and the oldest of them, Dobby, who had nightmares most nights and had learned not to talk about them, pressed both hands over his enormous heart and felt the pain signal hit him like a fist. His eyes went very wide. He had felt this before. He had felt something exactly like this, in the Malfoy dungeons, when the young master and his friends had thought it was amusing to. He shook his head hard. Now wasn't the time for that. He reached out with the careful, practiced sensitivity that house elves develop over years of service and read the signal as precisely as he could. Child. Young. Sick. Alone. Afraid. Magic so powerful it's coming out of him sideways and he doesn't even know it. Oh, Dobby said, very quietly, to the dark. Oh, the poor little thing. He couldn't leave. He was bound. But he tucked the knowledge somewhere careful inside himself, like a letter saved until the right moment, and he waited. Harry woke up the next morning feeling marginally better. The fever had broken sometime in the night and he was sweaty and cold at the same time and very thirsty, but the bone-deep ache had lessened from unbearable to merely present, which felt like progress. He lay still for a moment with his eyes closed, remembering the feeling from last night, that warmth, that pressure through the ceiling, that sensation of something enormous and safe breathing just above him. He reached up and touched the ceiling wood with 2 fingers. Nothing. Just wood. But the feeling lingered, like the memory of warmth after a fire goes out. Something had been there. He was as certain of it as he was certain of anything, and Harry had learned young to trust his own certainty because there wasn't much else available to trust. He heard Aunt Petunia's heels on the kitchen floor above him. Then Dudley's thundering descent, then Uncle Vernon's measured tread. The morning sounds of number 4. He pressed himself against the cupboard wall and waited to see if anyone would remember he was here. The footsteps passed his door. Passed again. He heard the kettle, heard the television, heard Dudley demanding something with great urgency and volume. The lock on his door didn't rattle. He was thirsty enough that his mouth tasted like copper. He'd been without water since Tuesday dinner. He pressed both palms flat against his door and he pushed, not with his hands, but with the thing inside him, the river thing, and the lock clicked open. He stood in the hallway for a moment, blinking in the light, deeply uncertain whether this had been a good idea. From the kitchen came the sounds of ordinary morning. He padded to the bathroom, drank from the tap for approximately 45 seconds, wiped his mouth, and padded back. The kitchen door didn't open. No one had heard him. He was almost back in the cupboard when he looked out the window beside the front door. There was a horse standing in the middle of Privet Drive. Except it wasn't quite a horse. It was the right shape for a horse, roughly, but it was entirely black, not dark brown that looked black, but a black so complete it seemed to have no highlight, no reflection, as if someone had cut a horse-shaped hole in the world and this thing existed in the absence. It had wings folded tight against its sides, and a face that was longer than a horse's face, and eyes that were white all the way through. It was looking directly at the window. Directly at Harry. Harry pressed his nose against the glass. The creature, the Thestral, though he had no word for it, didn't move. It just looked at him. Its white eyes had no expression that Harry could name, but the feeling they sent through the glass was familiar. It was the same feeling from last night, pushing down through the roof. I see you. I'm here. Harry put his hand flat on the glass. The Thestral stretched its long neck and pressed its nose against the other side. From somewhere far up the street, Mr. Jenkins was walking his terrier in the morning grey. The terrier strained its lead toward the middle of the road, barking at something Mr. Jenkins couldn't see, before Mr. Jenkins pulled it firmly away with an annoyed, "Nothing there, Biscuit," honestly. Sable didn't look at Mr. Jenkins or the terrier. She kept her white eyes on the child in the window, and Harry kept his hand on the glass, and they stayed like that for a long time in the cold morning with the whole street walking obliviously past them. 3 weeks later, the Desleys came home from shopping to find that every plant in Petunia's front garden had grown to twice its height, produced flowers out of season, and arranged themselves into a pattern that, from above, spelled something in a script that none of them could read. It was Rook's first message. It was in Centaur script and it translated as, "We are watching. Be careful of what you do next." They didn't know that, of course. Vernon thought it was vandalism and called the council. Petunia thought it was something freakish and watched Harry for 3 days with fresh suspicion. Dudley stood in the garden and looked at the flowers with his head tipped sideways and said, with unusual thoughtfulness for a 4-year-old, "It's pretty, Mummy." Petunia pulled him inside. Harry looked at the garden from his bedroom window, they'd let him sleep upstairs temporarily while they worked out what to do about the cupboard situation, mostly because leaving a sick child without water for 3 days had crossed even Petunia's threshold of what the neighbors could be allowed to potentially find out about, and he felt the same warm pressure from the garden that he'd felt from the ceiling 3 weeks ago. More of them, now. He could feel them all, the way you feel a crowd in a dark room, the warmth of bodies, the sense of breath, the weight of attention. The garden was just where it had surfaced, just where the signal had become visible. But the watching had been constant. He didn't know what they were. He didn't know why. He only knew he was less alone than he'd been 3 weeks ago, and that felt, to a 4-year-old who had spent most of his remembered life alone, like the most important thing in the world. Rook met with Thornwood and Cress in the deep forest, where the oak roots made walls and the stars were just visible through the canopy. They had been having this conversation, in its various forms, for 3 weeks now. Surrey is 60 miles, Thornwood said. He was dark bay and skeptical by nature, which Rook had always found useful. We can't operate inside a Muggle town. The statute is a wizarding document, Rook said. We signed nothing. The ministry would interpret, let them interpret. Rook moved through the root space, thinking with his hooves. The child is a magical being. He is our concern as much as theirs. More, perhaps, given that their way of concerning themselves has left him in a cupboard. Cress, who was grey and quiet and the best reader of signs Rook had trained in 40 years, was looking at the star map she'd drawn since the night of the signal. He sent out again last night, she said. Shorter. But more controlled. He's learning to do it intentionally. He's 4 years old, Thornwood said. Yes, Cress said, in the tone of someone for whom this was not an objection but a data point. Rook stopped moving. He stood with his chin up and his eyes moving over the forest canopy, reading. We need to get the goblins, he said. What Ragnarok found in those estate files is going to matter. And we need to talk to the Mare people about the Thameside wards. And we need, he paused, to find the witch. What witch? Thornwood asked. The one who was expelled from Hogwarts in 1968 for having more magical sensitivity than Dumbledore knew what to do with. She lives in the Highlands now. The unicorn herd in Cairngorms knows her. Cress lowered her star map. Miriam Ashgrove. You know her. I've met her twice. She's difficult. Rook almost smiled. Good, he said. Difficult is what we need. The Ministry's Creature Liaison Office received an unusual number of creature disturbance reports in November and December of 1984. A gnarl in someone's garden in Somerset that had built something peculiar with twigs and seemed to be pointing. A jobberknoll found dead in Wales, not unusual, they died constantly, but this one had reportedly repeated, in its death song, a specific address in Surrey rather than its usual catalogue of natural sounds. An outbreak of spontaneous plant growth in at least 4 locations around Little Whinging, all in patterns that the field officer described as deliberate but unidentifiable. The field officer, a bored, underpaid ministry employee named Clarence Hoppa, wrote in his report that the cases seemed to be possibly connected and possibly worth further investigation. The report sat in a tray for 2 weeks before being passed to another tray, where it sat for another week before being filed. The filing cabinet it was placed in was 3 doors down from Dumbledore's office, which had a standing instruction with the Ministry Archiving Department that any unusual magical events in Surrey were to be flagged and redirected to his desk immediately. The instruction had been put in place in 1981, when he placed Harry there. It had been renewed every 6 months without fail. It was, in Dumbledore's mind, a perfectly reasonable precaution, simply staying informed. But Clarence Hoppa's report, because it had been passed between 2 trays before filing, had been reclassified from unusual magical events, residential, to creature disturbances, rural/urban interface, which was a different filing code entirely, which did not trigger the redirecting instruction, which meant that Dumbledore's desk never received it. Small things. Small oversights. The kind that accumulate, unseen, until they become something that can't be managed. Dumbledore visited Privet Drive in December, as he did every December, under a concealment charm, standing on the pavement and looking at the front of the house and satisfying himself that the blood wards were holding. They were. They always were. Petunia's residence, Petunia's blood, the sacrificial love of Lily's death, it was all intact, all functioning, all precisely as designed. The house looked normal. The garden was slightly overgrown for December, which was odd for Petunia, but otherwise. He stood on the pavement and felt the blood wards and felt them holding. He did not, because he was not equipped to receive signals of that frequency, feel the 17 other things layered over and around and beneath Privet Drive. The Thestral watch. The centaur script in the garden's ley lines. The goblin ward spike readings from 17 stones. The faint, deliberate, increasingly purposeful pulse from the child inside who was learning, one small heartbeat at a time, to reach outward. He said to himself, "All is well," in the way that he often said it to himself, and went back to his other concerns. In March of the following year, on a night when the temperature had dropped back below freezing and the last of the winter was making one final argument, something happened on Privet Drive that Mrs. No. 7 described to her husband as a simply extraordinary amount of birds. There were, in fact, no birds. What there was, assembled in the air above and around No. 4 with no apparent concern for the statute of secrecy primarily because they had not agreed to it, was a delegation. Sable. 2 other Thestrals. A hippogriff who had flown down from Scotland and was managing the suburban environment with remarkable dignity. Several owls who were there in an advisory capacity. And one centaur, Cress, who had agreed to come because she was smaller than Thornwood and could move through the back garden without being seen from the road. They couldn't get to the child directly. The blood wards held them at a distance from the house proper, designed to repel magical intrusion, and they were strong enough that even Sable's particular phase state was insufficient to cross them. They had expected this. It was why Cress had brought what she'd brought. Harry was in the back garden, which the Dursleys used as a place to put him when Dudley wanted the whole house to himself and the weather was above freezing, which it barely was. He was sitting on the back step in a too large jumper and watching something under the garden wall where he'd found 3 beetles living in a crack in the brickwork. He'd named them. He wasn't sure if that was normal. He suspected many things about him were not normal, which was what the Dursleys told him, though they said it as a bad thing and he'd started wondering if maybe it wasn't. He heard Cress before he saw her. A sound at the back fence, a soft rhythmic sound, like something breathing very quietly. He looked up. A grey shape stood at the fence line, just outside the garden wall. It was tall, much taller than a person, and it had a woman's torso and a horse's body, and it was looking at him with dark, careful eyes. It had something tied to the fence post with a length of vine, a small bundle, leaves wrapped around something solid. Harry stood up. His heart was doing something complicated but he wasn't scared. He'd long since stopped being scared of the things that watched from outside the wards. They never hurt him. They never even tried to come close to him when he didn't want them to. They just watched, and sometimes, like now, they left things. He walked to the back fence. The centaur woman looked at him steadily. "Hello," Harry said. "Hello," Cress said. Her voice was low and even, like someone who chose each word once and used it once. "My name is Cress. I'm a friend of Sable's." "The horse with wings," Harry said, with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided to name his reality. "She's on the roof a lot." "She is." Something moved in Cress's eyes. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. "She watches over you." "Why?" A pause. The real answer was long and complicated and involved the boy's magic and the signal cry and the way the ancient world had organized itself in response to something unprecedented. Cress looked at the 4-year-old standing at the fence in his oversized jumper and gave him the only part of the answer that would actually land. "Because she wants to." Harry considered this. "Oh," he said, and something in his face shifted, very slightly, very briefly, from the careful watchfulness it usually wore to something softer and more unguarded and raw. He reached out and touched the bundle on the fence post. "What's this?" "Something for the fever. Saint More actions right the next chapter now." The Bond of Wild Things Chapter 2, The Language of Wild Things. The Scottish Highlands in April smelled like cold water and peat smoke and something green that didn't have a name, and Harry Potter, now 5.5 and considerably more alert than anyone who'd known him in Surrey would have credited, stood at the edge of a loch and watched a fish jump and thought, this is what outside is supposed to feel like. The cottage was 3 miles from the nearest road and existed, as far as the Muggle world was concerned, not at all. The wardwork on it was old, pre-ministry, pre-statute, the kind of layered protection that had been built by multiple hands over multiple generations and had become something organic, something that had grown into the landscape rather than been imposed on it. The hills around it knew it was there. The heather around it grew in a wide arc that avoided the property line with botanical precision. The loch in front of it had a family of Grindylows in its deep center who served, entirely voluntarily, as an early warning system, and who Harry had already been informed would be very unpleasant to anyone who came through the water uninvited. "What do they do?" he'd asked Cress, when she'd explained this on the journey north. "They pull people down," she'd said. "Oh," he'd said, and looked at the loch with new interest. The journey itself had taken 3 days and had been the most extraordinary 3 days of Harry's life, which was not a high bar given the preceding 5 years but was still genuine. Cress had come for him at night, a Tuesday night in late March, when Vernon and Petunia were watching television and Dudley was asleep, and Harry had been lying in the cupboard running through the letters in the reading books Cress had brought him. The lock had opened from outside. He'd looked up and found Cress's eye at the cupboard gap, and she'd said, very quietly, "It's time to go. Bring only what matters." What mattered fit in one pillowcase: the books, the bracelet, a photograph he'd found in a box in the attic of a man with messy black hair and a woman with green eyes who were laughing at whoever held the camera, and a smooth grey stone from the back garden that the Bowtruckles had pressed on him firmly when he'd said goodbye to them through the fence. He'd been ready in 90 seconds. Outside, Sable was waiting. Not alone, there were 2 other Thestrals, and the hippogriff who Harry had seen a few times in the air above the street and who, up close, was genuinely imposing in a way that made Harry's stomach do something complicated. Rook was there too, for the first time in person rather than as a presence Harry felt in the garden's ley lines. He was enormous. Harry had known he would be. Cress was big, and she described Rook as larger, but knowing and standing in front of him were different things. He looked down at Harry with those amber eyes for a long moment. Harry looked back. "Well," Rook said. "You're smaller than I expected." "You're bigger than I expected," Harry said, because it seemed fair. Something moved in Rook's face. He turned to Cress. "He'll do," he said, which was apparently high praise based on the way Cress straightened. They'd traveled by Thestral, Harry on Sable's back, which was both terrifying and the best thing that had ever happened to him, the 2 concepts existing simultaneously without contradiction. Sable ran 3 steps and then her wings opened and the ground fell away and Harry grabbed her mane and the cold air hit his face and the lights of Surrey shrank below him and he heard himself make a sound that was laughing, just pure laughing, for the first time he could remember. He pressed his face against Sable's neck and laughed into her mane while she climbed and the stars got closer. "Good." Cress called from the Thestral to his left. "Yes," Harry shouted, and the wind took it and it probably reached halfway to Birmingham. That had been 3 weeks ago. He was still adjusting to the cottage, to the space, to the Highlands' particular way of making you feel simultaneously very small and very present. And he was still adjusting to Miriam Ashgrove. Miriam Ashgrove was 34 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and appeared to have made a deliberate decision at some point in her life to be interested in everything and charmed by almost nothing. She had dark hair cut practically short and brown eyes that moved with the quick assessment of someone who was always reading the room, and she wore the same canvas jacket approximately 6 days out of 7 and kept a wand tucked behind her left ear like a pen. She had been living alone in this cottage for 6 years by the time Harry arrived, the nearest community being the village 3 miles north and the magical community being the Cairngorm's unicorn herd, the Kelpie in the loch's north end, and a semi-regular arrangement with the centaur scouts who passed through on their seasonal migrations. She had not been told Harry was coming until 48 hours before his arrival, because Rook knew her well enough to know that giving her more notice would result in significantly more debate and possibly a preemptive refusal, and by the time she'd worked through the argument against it, Harry had been there for 2 days and had already found the section of the bookshelves with the illustrated natural history volumes and was deeply absorbed in a chapter on bowtruckles. "He's reading that," she'd said to Rook. "He taught himself," Rook said. She'd looked at Harry, who looked back at her over the top of the book with his green eyes and his cracked glasses. Cress had fixed the lens but it had cracked again on the journey, and Miriam would fix it properly in a day or two once she'd figured out the prescription, and said, "That's the wrong chapter. The bowtruckle section has an error in the seasonal behavior description. I've been meaning to annotate it. Come here and I'll show you." Harry had come. She'd shown him. They'd been fine ever since. The arrangement, as Rook had explained it to her with the patiently concise manner he used when he'd already had a version of this conversation in his head 40 times, the child needed a safe location, a proper education, and access to the magical world that Dumbledore did not control. Miriam was qualified, trusted, known to the creature network, and sufficiently far outside the institutional wizarding world that she could operate without triggering any of the surveillance that Dumbledore maintained through Hogwarts, the Ministry, and the Order of the Phoenix. "I'm a tutor, then," she'd said. "Among other things," Rook had said. "What other things?" A pause. "Guardian. For now, until better arrangements can be formalized." Miriam had looked at the window, at the loch, at the thin spring light on the water. "What does he need?" "Everything," Rook said. "He hasn't had much of anything." She'd looked back at Rook for a long moment, and whatever passed between them had been enough, because she'd nodded once and gone to put the kettle on. Harry's first lesson with Miriam started not with magic but with silence. She took him to the east bank of the loch at 6 in the morning, when the mist was still sitting on the water and the birds were at full volume and the world smelled like wet grass and cold stone. They sat cross-legged on a flat boulder and she said, "Just listen. Don't try to identify anything, don't try to count anything. Just let it in." Harry sat and listened. After about 3 minutes he said, "Is something supposed to happen?" "Not yet." "How long do we do this?" "Until you feel the difference between listening at something and listening to something." She looked at the water. "Most wizards learn spells first. Latin words, wand movements, repeatable mechanics. There's nothing wrong with that, exactly, except it teaches you that magic is something you do to the world. Something you point outward." She tapped the center of her own sternum with 2 fingers. "What's in you isn't like that. You sent that signal in November. You knew the Loch Grindylows were afraid of you before I told you what they were. You grew 3 weeks' worth of plants in a Surrey garden without a wand or a word. Your magic isn't outward. It's relational. It listens first." Harry thought about this. "The signal," he said. "In November." She looked at him. "I know I did it," he said. "I don't know how I know. But I know." "You know because the answer came back," she said. "That's how you know you sent it." The world replied. He sat with that for a moment, turning it over. "Why did they come?" "All of them, all the creatures." Miriam picked up a flat stone and weighed it in her hand. "Because what you sent was real. Not a spell, not a designed magical effect, just you, hurting, raw, at full volume. Creatures respond to that. They don't have the wizarding habit of rationalizing other people's pain as someone else's business." She paused. "Some humans respond to it too. Most of us have it trained out of us pretty early." "Did you have it trained out?" She looked at him with a slight shift in expression that he couldn't quite decode yet, he was still learning her, and said, "I had the opposite problem. I couldn't turn it off. I walked into Hogwarts at 11 years old and felt the castle's magic like standing too close to a speaker. Every spell cast near me felt like someone shouting. I couldn't filter it. She threw the stone. It bounced 4 times before sinking. They called it instability. They tried to train me into standard channels. It didn't work. A pause. Dumbledore said I was a danger to myself and others. Are you? I'm a danger to people who deserve it, she said, and almost smiled, and picked up another stone. The lesson that morning, and most mornings, for the first month, was sensory. Not what magic could do but what it felt like, what it told you, how it moved in and around living things versus dead things, objects versus animals. Miriam didn't use formal frameworks. She used the actual world, which was, she said, the best textbook ever written and the one most wizarding schools completely ignored. By the end of the first week Harry could distinguish, without seeing, between the signature of the Grindylows in the lock and the Kelpie in the north end. They felt different. The Grindylows were quick and multiple, like a handful of small stones rattling. The Kelpie was singular and deep and faintly blue feeling, if a feeling could be blue, which Harry reported with some uncertainty and Miriam confirmed with a sharp nod. By the end of the second week he was having conversations with the Bowtruckles in the rowan tree behind the cottage. Not in words, they didn't use words, but in a call-and-responsive sensation that was approximately conversational. He would press his awareness toward them and they would respond, and they would indicate what they wanted or needed and he would either provide it or explain why he couldn't, and they had reached a functional and apparently satisfying arrangement that Miriam observed from the cottage doorway with the expression of someone watching something that they had theoretically known was possible but had never quite expected to see. That fast, she said to Rook, who had been visiting for the week and was standing beside her. His signal range is already wider than when he arrived, Rook said. He was watching Harry with the Bowtruckles with that careful amber attention. He's not doing anything deliberate. He just radiates. He knows things he shouldn't know yet. This morning he told me the Kelpie was hungry before I'd checked the markers. She watched Harry accept a small twig from a Bowtruckle with the gravity of someone receiving a meaningful gift. If I hadn't expelled myself from the standard framework I'd say that's impossible. It isn't impossible, Rook said. It's unprecedented, which is a different thing entirely. The real magic lessons came after the sensory work, once Miriam was satisfied that Harry had a stable enough internal landscape to build on. She introduced the wand not as the primary instrument but as one instrument among several, a focusing tool, she said, like a magnifying glass for sunlight. The light was the thing. The glass just directed it. Harry took to wand work with the same unnerving speed he took to everything, which Miriam privately found both gratifying and slightly alarming. He had never been formally taught magic. He had only ever done it accidentally. But the accidentally done magic had been building his instincts for 5 years without any of the structural interference that formal early education tended to create, and the result was someone who approached a spell not as a formula to be executed but as a request made of something that could choose to comply. That's not technically correct, Miriam told him, after his first proper lumos, which had produced a light roughly 4 times the expected brightness. It worked though, Harry said, looking at the light with interest. It worked too much. The spell has a standard output. You exceeded it. You said the wand was just a focusing tool. And you said my magic isn't outward, it's relational. He looked at her with those unreasonably direct green eyes. So I asked. And it said yes louder than I expected. Miriam opened her mouth and then closed it. She stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to be extremely annoying to teach, aren't you?" "Probably," Harry said, without apology. She taught him anyway. She was, despite herself, having the time of her professional life. 3 months in, Albus Dumbledore noticed Harry was gone. It didn't happen the way you might expect, not a sudden alarm, not a frantic realization. It happened the way many important things happen to very busy men who believe their systems are infallible, slowly, and then all at once. He had been in the middle of a complicated set of negotiations with the Ministry over the classification of several dark artifacts recovered from a Death Eater raid, and he had also been managing the early stages of what he suspected was Voldemort's return, the whispers coming from Eastern Europe, the tremors in the Dark Lord's former territories, and he had also been managing Hogwarts, and the Order, and 24 other things that constituted the constant labor of being Albus Dumbledore. The man who held the wizarding world together through sheer accumulated gravity. He sent his annual check-in owl to Petunia Dursley in mid-June. She replied, surprisingly quickly, which itself should have been a flag, that Harry was fine, perfectly healthy, no magical incidents of note. The letter was short and stiff and had the quality of something written under instruction. He sent the letter to his desk tray and moved on. It was Minerva McGonagall who actually triggered the realization, though she didn't know she was doing it. She was reviewing the annual status check on the Magical Children list, the Hogwarts intake tracking that monitored all children of wizarding lineage born in Britain, and she noticed, with a slight frown, that Harry Potter's magical activity register had been showing an unusual pattern for the past several months. All children on the register showed a baseline magical activity level, accidental magic flickers, the small involuntary discharges of growing power. Harry's register had been showing a different pattern since late March. Not accidental magic. Not flickers. Something more deliberate, more consistent, and, this was the part that gave Minerva pause, geographically shifted. The signal wasn't coming from Surrey. She brought it to Dumbledore on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of grey-skied June day that turned Hogwarts corridors a particular deep amber. She set the register chart on his desk and said, without preamble, because she had never been good at preamble, something's wrong with Harry Potter's location tracking. Dumbledore looked at the chart. He looked at it for slightly longer than a glance but not quite as long as a study. He set it down. He said, these registers aren't particularly precise. The margin of error over long distances can be, Albus. Minerva put her finger on the chart. That's Scotland. The register is placing him in the Scottish Highlands. Since late March. A silence. In that silence, the careful, experienced ear might have detected the sound of several assumptions cracking. He sent an owl to Petunia that evening. This one was urgent, marked clearly, asked a direct question. It came back 2 days later with a single line, he's fine. He sent a wizard by Fleur to the neighborhood, a nondescript order member who could pass as a door-to-door salesman. The wizard reported back that number 4 appeared normal, the Dursleys appeared normal, but had not actually seen the boy. Dumbledore sat at his desk in the evening light and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling, the sensation of a situation that had proceeded without him. He was not immediately alarmed. He was methodical. He began working through the possibilities. The blood wards would have held, the Ministry would have flagged any hostile magical incident in the area, there was no indication of dark activity. Harry was most likely safe. But who had moved him, and why, and without informing him, he pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and wrote, in his careful, elegant script, to the 3 people he trusted most with questions that required delicacy. He wrote to Arabella Figg, the squib he'd installed in Little Whinging as a watcher. He wrote to Arthur Weasley, who had excellent contacts in the creature liaison community. He wrote to Aberforth. Arabella Figg replied immediately and with significant guilt. She had noticed Harry was gone in April. She had not reported it because she'd assumed Dumbledore had arranged it. She apologized profusely and was clearly terrified. Arthur wrote back that his creature liaison contacts had been, peculiarly, very quiet on all fronts for the past 6 months, which was in itself unusual. Nothing bad, just quiet. He'd ask around. Aberforth didn't reply, which was normal. Dumbledore folded the letters and held them and looked at his fireplace. His first instinct was concern. His second instinct, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it, was control. Somewhere in the country, his most important piece had been moved without his knowledge, and whoever had moved it had done so cleanly enough that he hadn't noticed for 3 months. That spoke to either extraordinary competence or extraordinary coordination, and both of those options were more unsettling, in their way, than simple hostile action would have been. He began making plans. In Scotland, no one knew Dumbledore had noticed, because the network had surveillance on most of his communication methods and were watching for exactly this, but the owl to Arabella Fig had been sent by a personal owl rather than the school post, and the reply had come back through a Muggle-adjacent channel. A small gap. Ragnarok noted it in his files with the precise annotation of someone who knew that small gaps had a way of mattering eventually, and flagged it to Rook. "He knows Harry is gone," Rook told Miriam. Miriam was sitting on the floor of the cottage with Harry, both of them surrounded by open books, in the middle of what appeared to be a heated debate about whether the quintape or the chimera was the more dangerously misrepresented magical creature in the standard texts. She looked up at Rook. "How long have we got? Before he identifies the location. He'd need to work through the magical registers, the creature sighting reports, Rook paused, calculating. 6 weeks. Perhaps 8. And the new wards? The Goblin team arrives Thursday." He looked at Harry, who was looking back at him with the alert, measuring gaze he'd developed over the past months. Nothing was ever lost on him anymore, and hadn't been for a while, but now he had enough context to understand what he was observing. "The wards will be layered over the existing ones. 30 layers. The first 20 will simply redirect any location detection attempt toward a decoy address in Inverness. The last 10 will be active rather than passive." "Active how?" Harry asked. "Anyone attempting a forced entry would experience a rather comprehensive reversal of their own momentum," Rook said. "Goblins are very precise about the definition of forced. What about non-forced? What if someone just walks up and knocks?" Rook looked at him. "Then they get a chance to explain themselves before the Grindylows are involved." Harry looked at the lock through the window with the expression of someone adding information to a file. "Okay," he said, and went back to his book. Miriam met Rook's eyes over Harry's head. The look they exchanged was the kind shared by two people who were both, in their different ways, deeply impressed and not quite ready to say so. The Goblin team arrived Thursday. There were 5 of them, small, precise, carrying equipment in cases that hummed faintly when opened, moving through the cottage grounds with the focused efficiency of engineers who had done this particular job 10,000 times and had no patience for anything that wasn't the job. Their team lead was a goblin named Skarek who was approximately 90 years old, which in goblin terms was somewhere in peak professional maturity, and who said less than any professional person Harry had ever encountered. Harry watched them work from the cottage roof, where he'd climbed because it was the best vantage point. After about 20 minutes, Skarek looked up at him. "You can feel us placing them," Skarek said. "Not a question." "A little bit," Harry said. "It's like someone tightening a belt around something. Not tight enough to hurt. Just firm." Skarek stared at him. Then he turned back to his team and said something in gobbledygook, and one of the other goblins glanced up at Harry and said something back, and Skarek said something else, and whatever the exchange was, when Skarek turned back to the work his movements were slightly, not reverential. Goblins did not do reverential, but attentive, in a way they hadn't been before. That evening, when the ward work was done and the team had been fed and given the good whiskey that Miriam kept for exactly these occasions, Skarek sat at the kitchen table and looked across it at Harry and said, "The ward stones your father placed in 1979 were among the best we'd seen. He had a feel for them." Harry was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know him." "I know." Skarek's expression shifted. "You have the same signature. When you're near a ward stone, it resonates differently than it would with another wizard. Responds more readily." He picked up his whiskey glass and looked into it. "Ragnarok wanted me to tell you, the Potter estate accounts have been isolated and protected. Nothing has moved from them since 1981 that wasn't court documented. When the time comes, everything that is yours will be yours." Harry sat with this. "Ragnarok's building a case." "Ragnarok is building a fortress," Skarek said, and finished his whiskey. Midsummer brought a kind of settled rhythm that Harry hadn't known existed. The days had a shape, early mornings at the lock with Miriam, the sensory work progressing from simple recognition to active dialogue with the water creatures. Late mornings with books. Miriam's library was extensive and unorthodox, and she let him read anything he wanted, which turned out to be everything. Afternoons were practical magic, which was the thing Harry had to actively manage because his instinct was always to ask the magic rather than command it, and this produced spectacular results about 70% of the time and genuinely alarming results the other 30%. Again, Miriam said, on a Tuesday afternoon in July, standing with her arms crossed in the West Meadow, watching Harry attempt a contained incendio. The flame produced was roughly the size of a small shed fire. The meadow grass scorched in a perfect circle around him. He did not appear to be in danger. The fire did not touch him. He was, in fact, standing in the center of it looking slightly frustrated. "I'm containing it," he said. "You're containing yourself in it," Miriam said. "That's the wrong way around. Feels the same from in here. Does it?" He thought about it. He let the fire down, which it did smoothly, the flames simply dimming and going out the way a volume turns down. The scorched grass steamed slightly. "Okay. No. It feels different. The fire is," he made a shape with his hands, a cupping gesture. "It wanted to be bigger. I let it be as big as it wanted and then held the edge. And if something had been on the other side of the edge, then I'd have moved the edge before it got there." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is either an impressive level of control or a very alarming level of confidence, and I'm not completely sure which." "Both?" he offered. She sighed and almost smiled. "Again. This time, decide what size you want before you start. Ask for that size. Don't just let it go and grab the edge." He tried again. The fire was the size of a campfire, precise and controlled. He held it for 30 seconds, then let it down cleanly. "Better," Miriam said. She made a note in the small journal she kept on his progress. The one she told him was for calibration purposes and which he suspected also contained observations that were less clinical in nature. "Now try it without the wand." The fire came without the wand. Slightly smaller, slightly different in color, more orange than the wand-produced version, a shade more gold. It behaved identically in terms of control. Harry held it in his palm, turning his hand slightly, watching the way it moved with him rather than fighting gravity. Miriam's pen stopped. "This is normal?" Harry asked, looking up. "No," she said, honestly. "Nothing about you is normal. That's not a criticism." She leaned forward. "What does it feel like?" "Like asking," he said. "Like the fire was already there and I just asked it to be visible." She wrote that down. She wrote it carefully and underlined it. That evening she wrote to Rook, "He produced wandless fire today with complete control. Age 5 years, 10 months. His magic doesn't behave like a tool. It behaves like a language he was born speaking. I don't have a framework for this. I think we may need to stop using frameworks." Rook's reply came the next morning, carried by a hawk owl who deposited it with absolute authority on her window sill and watched her read it. Agreed. Teach him everything you know. Don't worry about what order it should go in. He'll find his own order. In September, Dumbledore made his first move. He didn't find the cottage. The decoy wards had worked perfectly. Any location detection magic sent toward the Scottish Highlands for Harry Potter found an unremarkable address in Inverness that had been carefully seeded with trace magical signatures and whose current squib inhabitant had been quietly compensated for the occasional odd owl arriving. Dumbledore had a colleague visit the Inverness address and report back. But he'd done something else. He'd requested a formal review of the Potter estate guardianship arrangement through the Wisengamot, citing his existing role as executor and the need for formal documentation of the child's current situation. It was careful and measured and legal, and it was absolutely an attempt to use institutional channels to reassert control. Ragnarok received the Wisengamot filing on a Friday morning. He read it twice. He set it down. He called for Filch Blink. "Get me the Dumbledore vault audit we completed in August," he said. "And the 1979 Potter Estate Charter. And the formal complaint we've been preparing regarding the misuse of estate funds for blood ward maintenance without documented guardian consent." He paused. "And the secondary complaint regarding the unauthorized removal of the child from the Potter family solicitor's registered care authority." Filch blinked. "We're filing all of them simultaneously." "We're filing all of them simultaneously on Monday," Ragnarok said, "before his Wisengamot review is even scheduled." "Yes." On Monday morning, Dumbledore arrived at his ministry contact's office to discuss the guardianship review and found his contact in the middle of managing 3 separate Goblin Nation formal complaints, all filed that morning, all directly referencing the Potter estate, and all requiring response within 30 working days under the terms of the Gringotts Ministry Accord of 1947, which was legally binding in a way that made the Wisengamot look like a suggestions box. His ministry contact looked at him across 3 piles of parchment and said, with the expression of a man whose morning had taken a terrible turn, "Albus, what exactly has been going on with the Potter boy?" Dumbledore looked at the complaints. He read them with the care they deserved. Then he set them down and said, calmly, "I think there may have been some administrative misunderstandings that I can clear up relatively straightforwardly." His ministry contact nodded hopefully. He went back to Hogwarts and sat in his office and thought for a long time. Whoever had moved Harry had access to Goblin legal machinery. Not just access, they were using it proactively, not reactively. This wasn't a rescue. This was a campaign, and it had been running for months, and it was being run by someone who understood both legal structures and their weaknesses better than he'd anticipated. He couldn't file back immediately. Filing back would look defensive, and more importantly it would make the conflicts public, and public conflicts over a child's welfare were the kind of thing that the Daily Prophet would find interesting in ways he could not currently afford. He needed a softer approach. He thought about who, among his trusted circle, could approach the child without triggering whatever security apparatus had been built around him. Who wouldn't be perceived as a threat? Who Harry might trust? He thought of Hagrid. Harry turned 6 in July, and September found him in the meadow above the cottage practicing something that Miriam had initially described as theoretical, and was now reluctantly conceding was, apparently not. He was redirecting weather. Not creating weather. Not commanding it. Redirecting, nudging the pressure systems with careful sustained attention, the way you might redirect a river with a hand rather than a dam. The result was that the rain clouds that had been building over the loch since morning had shifted slightly south, enough to keep the meadow dry while the loch shore got thoroughly watered. Miriam sat on a boulder watching him and drinking tea and being very careful about her expression. "You're doing the face," Harry said, without turning around. "I don't have a face." "The face where you're impressed and don't want to say so because you think it'll make me careless." She looked at the sky. "When I was 16, she said, I could feel weather building about 4 hours before it arrived. That was considered remarkable." A pause. "You're moving it." "Asking it to move," Harry said. The clouds continued their gentle migration southward. "There's a difference." "Yes, I know, you've explained the philosophy." She finished her tea. "The next lesson is wards." He turned around then, interested. "Goblin-style wards?" "My style. Which borrows heavily from Goblin methodology but also incorporates what I learned from the centaur techniques for territory marking. The principle is the same as everything else we've done, it's relational," Harry said. "You don't put the ward on the space. You ask the space to be unwelcoming to certain things." She stared at him. "I was going to explain that. I've been watching Scarx teams work since July. I worked it out." She put down her tea mug. "Of course you did." She stood up. "Come on, then. Let's see if you can actually do it or if you've just theorized it." He could actually do it. The ward he placed on the cottage gate was, when she tested it, more layered than anything she could have produced at his age by a margin that she chose not to calculate too precisely. It didn't just repel the specific threat she'd asked him to design against. It communicated, it sent a clear sensation to any approaching presence, a message that was unmistakably, not here, not now, find another way. She tested it twice. Both times she got the message as clearly as a spoken sentence. That's new, she said. Felt right, Harry said. It's going to feel right a lot, she told him. I need you to keep documenting everything anyway. For Rook. And for, she paused. For what? She looked at him. He was 6 years old, small for his age, wearing a jumper that fit him now because she'd bought it for him rather than Dudley's hand-me-downs, with his wild black hair and his green eyes and his cracked glasses that she really needed to deal with properly. He looked back at her with that infuriating steady patience. For when it matters, she said. Because this is all building toward something. You know that. I know, he said. You're not scared. He thought about it with genuine consideration, the way he did with questions that deserved it. No, he said. I was scared when I was in the cupboard. I was scared every day. He looked out at the loch, at Sable's shape moving over the water in a slow bank, black wings catching the afternoon light. I'm not scared now. He searched for the word, ready. The certainty in it was absolute and quiet and not performed for anyone's benefit. Miriam looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly professional. Then she said, good. Because ready is exactly what you need to be. She went inside to make dinner. Harry stayed in the meadow a few minutes longer, watching Sable, and reached out with the warm relational pulse of his magic, not at her specifically, just outward, the way he'd been doing since November 2 years ago, the way that had started all of this. He felt the whole network answer, Sable's wing-beat response, the Grindylows' quick rattle from the loch, the Bowtruckles in the Rowan, the Kelpie's deep blue hum from the north end, the distant but clear amber warmth of Rook somewhere south in the Forbidden Forest. And something else. Something new. A gathering energy from many directions at once, too many to count, too many to name. Moving toward a single point. Something assembling itself with patience and purpose out of 100 separate decisions. Something coming together. He stood in the meadow with the highland wind in his hair and the evening coming down gold over the loch, and he thought, whatever it is, I want to be there. He went inside for dinner. Chapter 3, The Parliament of Creatures. The Forbidden Forest in October was a different world than the Forbidden Forest in any other month. The trees went copper and red in a particular shade of amber that existed nowhere else in Britain, and the canopy was thick enough that the light came through in shafts rather than sheets, so that walking through it felt like walking through a cathedral that had been built by something with a longer memory than architecture. The floor was soft. The sounds were deep and layered, and if you were quiet enough you could hear things moving that you'd never see. Harry heard 6 distinct things before he reached the clearing, and identified 5 of them. The 6th was something large and deliberate that moved parallel to the path at about 30 feet without coming closer, and when he mentioned it to Rook, who was walking beside him with the measured, ground-eating stride of a centaur who had covered this terrain 10,000 times, Rook said, without looking, Acromantula Scout. Aragog sent 2. They're observing. Should I wave? Harry asked. Rook looked at him. Don't encourage them. Harry didn't wave. But he turned his head toward the parallel movement and sent a small warm pulse in that direction, just acknowledgement, just I know you're there, and the movement paused for 2 full seconds before resuming. Rook noticed. You didn't do that with any instruction from me, Rook said. No, Harry said. And you know what you sent? Recognition. Something like, hello, I'm not afraid. He thought about it. Is that wrong? Rook was quiet for a moment. It's not wrong. It's unexpected. Acromantulas don't receive that kind of communication from wizards. Wizards are either hunting them or running from them. A pause. The scout has told Aragog. Aragog will be curious about you. Is that good? It depends on Aragog's mood, which has been variable since his eye condition worsened. Rook stepped over a root with the automatic grace of long habit. Be respectful, be direct, don't lie to him. He can sense dishonesty the way all spiders can, through vibration. Lies change the frequency of your voice. Harry stored this with the same careful attention he gave everything Rook told him, which was the quality that Rook had decided, in the privacy of his own assessment, made the boy singular. Not the magical power, though that was real and growing and would matter enormously. But the attention. The way he listened without waiting for his turn to speak. The way he absorbed information and let it change him rather than fitting it into what he already thought. The clearing appeared around a bend in the path, and Harry stopped. He'd been told what to expect. Miriam had described it, Rook had described it, Cress had given him a list of the factions she expected to attend. He had, he thought, a reasonable mental picture. He was wrong about the scale. The clearing was large enough that the tree line at the far end was 50 yards away, and it was full. Not packed, not crowded, but inhabited in every register. Centaurs stood in groups of 3 and 4 toward the northern edge, their conversation low and continuous and underscored by the sound of hooves shifting on earth. A delegation of merpeople occupied a long stone trough that had been constructed at the clearing center specifically for this occasion, the water in it carrying a faint phosphorescence that gave their section of the clearing a deep-sea quality. Thestrals, a dozen of them, possibly more, stood in the shadows at the tree line, their white eyes catching the light in the dark. Goblins occupied a raised section of route near the eastern edge, seated at a makeshift table, with documents and ink and the general air of people who had come to work. The Acromantula delegation, 2 enormous spiders that made the back of Harry's neck do something immediate and instinctive, were positioned at the southern edge with careful distance maintained between them and everyone else. And others. More that Harry couldn't immediately categorize, shapes in the upper branches, presences at the tree line, 2 creatures he recognized from Miriam's books as unicorns standing in the light of their own luminescence at the western edge. Rook stepped into the clearing and the sound level dropped, the way rooms drop when the person everyone has been waiting for arrives. He didn't do anything to signal his presence. He just moved, with the authority of someone who has earned it rather than claimed it, to the center of the clearing, and everyone else adjusted. 6 months ago, Rook said, without preamble, in a language that Harry understood with some surprise because it wasn't English and it wasn't any language he'd been formally taught, but it sat in him naturally, like something remembered rather than learned, the old common tongue, old as the ley lines, spoken by nothing human for centuries. I sent letters. You answered. We are here because a child cried in the dark and every one of us heard it. We are here because we have been hearing it, in smaller ways, every day since. And we are here because the people who put him in that dark are the same people who have been telling us, for 300 years, that our concerns are secondary to their convenience. The clearing was very quiet. I will not make the argument for action, Rook continued. You have already made it, by coming. I will instead ask, what have you each decided to do, and how do we make sure those decisions reinforce each other rather than conflict? He stepped back. And the Parliament of Creatures began. Harry sat beside Cress in the Centaur section, not because she'd been told to supervise him but because they'd walked in together and she was where his sense of familiar safe had placed him. He watched the proceedings with the same complete attention he gave everything, and what he saw was not what he'd expected. He couldn't have said exactly why, something ceremonial. Something performed. He'd half imagined it as the wizarding Wisengamot, from Miriam's descriptions, formal, hierarchical, the important voices speaking and the rest listening. This was nothing like that. This was a conversation, a real one, with all the friction and direction change and unexpected alliance that real conversations had. The Goblin delegation, led by a goblin Harry hadn't met, older than Skarek, with the careful eyes of someone who had been calculating since before breakfast, opened by presenting the legal documentation they'd assembled regarding the Potter estate. They spoke in precise, clipped terms, the language of formal complaint and institutional remedy. The Mere-People representative, speaking through a translation charm that rendered the hissing water language as rough accented English, pointed out that the Thames-side wards protecting several Mere-People settlements had been weakened when Dumbledore had diverted ward maintenance resources toward the Blood wards in Surrey, something they had documented and were prepared to formally protest to the Ministry. The Unicorn Elder, who communicated not in words but in imagery, somehow, that Harry received as pictures rather than language, transmitted a sequence of images showing decades of their kind being hunted for their blood and horns by people whose connections to Ministry license exemptions went back to named individuals Harry didn't recognize but Rook clearly did. The acromantulas were direct in the way that very large spiders tended to be direct. One of them, not Aragog, but a delegate, said that the colonies in the forest had been under systematic pressure from Ministry-sanctioned extermination orders for 30 years, and the only reason those orders hadn't been executed was Dumbledore's personal intervention. Which sounded like a point in Dumbledore's favor, until the delegate added that the orders had also been systematically renewed, kept alive, kept threatening, by a process that required Dumbledore to intervene, which meant the colonies existed in a state of permanent dependency on his goodwill rather than any actual protected status. Harry thought about that. He thought about it the way he thought about everything that connected to the thing Miriam had started explaining to him, carefully, in small pieces, the architecture of how Dumbledore kept things. How many different groups existed in some version of that relationship, where survival required ongoing gratitude. He looked at Rook. Rook was watching him. "You understand," Rook said quietly, next to him. "Not a question." "He keeps everyone needing him," Harry said. "Not safe. Needing. So they can't stop." Rook looked at the Parliament with those amber eyes. "Yes. That's it exactly. Is that what he did with me?" A pause. Rook didn't answer immediately, which was how Harry knew it mattered. "He put you somewhere that guaranteed you would need rescuing," Rook said. "And he positioned himself as the only one who could do it. When the time was right, by his reckoning." Harry sat with this. He watched the Mere-People representative gesture at a map of the Thames wards. He watched the Goblin Elder make a notation. He watched the Thestrals at the tree line standing in their still, patient way, not participating in the formal discussion, but present, witness. "What about Voldemort?" he said. He'd been told the name and told not to fear it, by Miriam, who said that fear of a name was fear of a sound and there were better things to be afraid of. Rook glanced at him sideways. "What about him?" "Dumbledore put me in Surrey because of him. Because of what Trelawney's prophecy said." He'd been told about the prophecy too. Miriam's view of information was that children should have it, and handle it, and be stronger for the handling. So some of what Dumbledore did was real protection. "Yes. Yes," Rook said. "And a locked cage is real shelter too. The question is whether shelter is the whole story or just the part you're told." The Parliament shifted in focus, the formal presentations were done and the actual negotiation was beginning. The thing Rook had said was the real purpose, deciding how the individual decisions reinforced each other. Harry watched this with great interest. The Goblins were the most organized. They had clearly already mapped their legal actions and were presenting them as a fait accompli, not asking for permission but explaining what they would do and when and offering the other parties the chance to align their own actions with the timing. The Centaurs were more flexible but deeply principled about territory and precedent. The Mere-People wanted specific ward guarantees. The acromantulas wanted, essentially, to be left alone, but expressed in terms of formal protected status that would survive changes in Hogwarts leadership. It was, Harry realized, a set of negotiations between parties who trusted each other in some areas and not in others, who had different priorities and different leverage points, and who were finding, with effort and friction and occasional raised voices that crossed language barriers through sheer volume, something that worked for everyone. Not a perfect solution. A functional one. He had never seen adults do that before. He had seen adults force solutions. He had seen adults impose solutions. He had occasionally seen Miriam and Rook disagree and negotiate towards something neither had proposed initially, which was the closest he'd seen before today. But this scale, this many different kinds of minds working toward a thing that served all of them without erasing any of them, he felt it as the same thing as magic. The relational thing. Not commanding. Not imposing. Asking, and adjusting when the ask was wrong, and asking again. He hadn't expected to spend this parliament mostly sitting and watching and thinking. He'd imagined, with some private 6-year-old excitement that he hadn't mentioned to anyone, a more active role. But what he was getting was something more valuable, and somewhere under the watching and thinking he understood that Rook had known that when he'd invited him. The point at which the parliament directly involved Harry came 3 hours in, when Rook said his name. "Harry Potter is here today as a witness, not a symbol," Rook said, and there was a slight adjustment in the clearing's atmosphere at the name, not shock, they all knew, but something that was the group version of "so this is him." "I want to be clear about that. He is not here to ratify our decisions or legitimate them. He doesn't need to do that. We are not here because of him. We are here because of ourselves, and our own interest in a world that is something other than what it currently is." He paused. "But I also think he should speak, if he wishes to. Because this concerns him, and treating him as a symbol while talking about him would be the same error that got him put in a cupboard in the first place." Every face, or the closest equivalent, in the clearing turned toward Harry. He stood up. He had, honestly, not prepared anything. He looked out at the parliament, at the centaurs, at the goblins with their documents, at the mere people in their trough, at the Thestrals at the tree line, at the unicorn's steady light, at the acromantula's patient stillness, and he thought about what was true. "I didn't know any of you existed," he said. His voice was steady. "I mean, I knew things existed. Miriam's books have things in them. But knowing there's a word for something and knowing the thing are different." He stopped. Started again. "For 2 years I had, something. Something that felt like company, without being able to see it. I knew something was there. On the roof, in the garden, at the fence." He looked at Sable, who had moved to the edge of the clearing. She turned her white eyes on him. "I knew someone was listening. I didn't know it was this many someones." A sound moved through the clearing, not language, not quite, but the sound of things that had been listening for a long time receiving confirmation. "I'm not going to stand here and say I know what to do," Harry continued. "I don't. I'm 6. Miriam's been teaching me things and Rook's been teaching me other things and I'm not small in the way I used to be small. I know what I can do now. I know what I'm going to be able to do." He said this with the same flat certainty he said everything he knew to be true. "But I'm not standing in front of you as someone who's going to save anything. He searched for Miriam's phrasing, that's the same story with different people. The chosen one who fixes everything. I don't want to be that." He looked at Rook. Rook's expression was a very particular shade of attention that Harry had learned meant continue. "I want this," Harry said, and gestured, at the clearing, at all of them, at the whole improbable parliament of impossible creatures gathered in an October forest. "I want whatever this is. Not me at the top of it. Just, this. All of us deciding things together, because we're the ones who live here." He stopped, feeling slightly self-conscious. "That's all I have." He sat down. The clearing was quiet for 2 seconds. Then the goblin elder made a sound that was, in goblin culture, the equivalent of a standing ovation, a single sharp click of the tongue, dignified and deliberate. The mere people representative made a sound that could only be described as the sea recognizing itself. The Thestrals at the tree line stepped forward, together, 2 paces into the clearing light, the Thestral equivalent of applause, which Sable had explained to Harry once and which he recognized with a sudden tightening in his chest. Rook said nothing. He was looking at the sky with the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and just felt it lighten slightly. Hagrid arrived at the edge of the Forbidden Forest at mid-afternoon. He was not subtle about it. Hagrid was constitutionally incapable of subtle, he was 11 feet tall, which made stealth a structural challenge, and he moved through undergrowth the way a very large and cheerful force of nature moves through undergrowth, which is to say with tremendous goodwill and absolute acoustic presence. The Parliament had been warned by the Acromantula scouts 20 minutes before he appeared, which had given Rook time to make a decision. "He's not a threat," Cress said, from Rook's left. "He's not personally a threat," Rook agreed. "He's an envoy. For Dumbledore. For Dumbledore. Who has found us faster than Ragnarok predicted." Rook looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "Do you want to meet him?" "Yes," Harry said, without hesitation. Rook turned to Cress. "Bring him in." Hagrid came through the tree line with a crashingly obvious attempt at quiet movement and stopped at the clearing's edge with his enormous brown eyes going very wide and very still as he took in what was in front of him. He'd been in the Forbidden Forest hundreds of times. He knew most of its inhabitants by name and disposition. But he had never seen all of them in one place, organized, deliberate, looking back at him with collective attention. "Blimey," he said, very quietly. "Hagrid." Rook's voice carried across the clearing without being raised. "You're welcome here. We'd appreciate an honest conversation about why you've come." Hagrid straightened to his full height, not a threat gesture, just Hagrid being Hagrid, which was that he occupied space without apology, and said, "Dumbledore sent me. He's worried aboo, Harry. He wants to know the boy's safe." "The boy," Rook said, "is here." Hagrid's eyes moved through the clearing and found Harry, sitting in the centaur section, and went very still in a different way, a wet, complicated way. He took a large breath. "Harry," he said, in a voice that was trying to be steady and not quite managing it. "I knew your parents. James and Lily. They were wonderful people." Harry looked at him. He felt, unexpectedly, something move in him, not suspicion at all, but something real and aching because here was someone who had known them, who had held his face when he said their names. "I know," he said. "Rook told me about them. Miriam found some books. He stopped. I'd like to know more. About them. If you know things." Hagrid's eyes were, there was no way around it, leaking. He pressed the back of his hand to them with the dignity of a man who was not going to cry in a parliamentary clearing if he could help it. "Yeah," he said, roughly. "Yeah, I know plenty." "I'd like that," Harry said. "But I know Dumbledore sent you too." "So, both things are true," Hagrid said, with simple honesty that was, Harry thought, the most Hagrid thing he could have said. "Dumbledore sent me because he's worried. And I came because I wanted to see you with my own eyes." He looked around at the clearing, at the centaurs, the goblins, the Thestrals, all of it. This is something, isn't it? All of them, together." "Yes," Harry said. "It is." Hagrid sat down, which he did the way he did everything, with massive and complete commitment, and the ground registered his presence audibly. He looked at Rook with something between respect and wariness, which was probably the right balance. "Dumbledore wants to meet with the boy," he said, dropping the ambassador pretense because there'd been no point in it from the moment he walked into the clearing and he knew it. "He wants to talk. He said he's not, he said his concern is the boy's safety. Voldemort's getting stronger, we know what's been happening," Rook said. "Then you know Harry'll need training. Proper training. Hogwarts, Harry is being trained." Hagrid looked at Harry, who met his look evenly. Whatever he saw in Harry's face made him pause. Hagrid stopped. "He looks all right," he said, quietly. "He looks better than all right." "He is," Cress said. "He has been, since we brought him here." "Dumbledore didn't know," Hagrid said, and there was something pained in it, not a defense, more an explanation. "About the Dursleys. What it was like." "If he'd known, he had every resource available to know," Rook said, without heat, just precision. "He chose the resource of distance. That is a choice. We are not here to argue about its reasons, which I suspect were genuinely protective in their intention. We are here because intention doesn't define outcome. Outcome does. Hagrid was quiet. He was, Harry thought, the kind of person who took things improperly rather than immediately rebutting them, the kind of person who heard something hard and let it land. So he can't see Harry, he said finally. That's what you're saying. I'm saying Harry will decide who he sees, Rook said. Not me. Not Dumbledore. Harry. Every face in the clearing went to Harry. He thought about it. He thought about what he knew of Dumbledore, not from bitterness, not from rehearsed grievance, but from information, the guardianship structure, the blood wards, the estate funds, the pattern of control through dependency that ran through every account of his actions like a signature. He thought about Ragnarok's files and Miriam's expulsion and the Acromantula's extermination orders and the 30 other shapes the same thing took when you looked at it from different angles. Not now, he said. Not yet. When I'm ready. He looked at Hagrid. Tell him Harry Potter says he'll arrange a meeting when he's ready. Not before. Hagrid blinked. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at this 6-year-old child with his wild black hair and his green eyes and his absolute untroubled certainty and he said, very quietly, he's not going to like that. No, Harry agreed. I expect he won't. Something moved across Hagrid's face, complicated, the face of a man caught between loyalties, genuinely. Harry felt for him. He reached forward and put his hand on Hagrid's enormous forearm, which was, relative to Harry's hand, like placing a leaf on a log. I'd still like to hear about my parents, he said. You could write. Miriam lets me get letters. Hagrid looked at the hand on his arm. Looked at Harry's face. Nodded, several times, the way he nodded when he was managing something large. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'll write. Thank you for coming, Harry said. I mean it. Not as a political thing. I mean it. Hagrid stood up, which involved the ground again, and he looked around the clearing one more time. At the centaurs and the goblins and the mere people and the Thestrals and the unicorns and the 2 Acromantulas who had been, until now, keeping a diplomatic distance. He looked at all of it with those wet brown eyes and he said, right. Okay. I'll tell him. He began moving toward the tree line and then stopped. Turned back. For what it's worth, he said to Rook directly, I'm glad he's got this. All of this. He swept his arm at the clearing. I always thought, someone should've, he stopped. Never mind. All right, he said to Harry, and went back into the forest, and his enormous footsteps faded, and the Parliament exhaled. The formal coalition pact was ratified as the sun moved toward the tree line, going gold, the clearing filling with the long shadow light of late afternoon. It was not a document. Rook had argued against a written document on the grounds that documents could be seized, leaked, used as evidence of organized resistance, and that what they were formalizing was better expressed as a set of spoken commitments witnessed by everyone present. The goblins had, after considerable discussion, agreed, on the condition that they could maintain their own internal records in gobbledygook, which was acceptable. The commitments were these, that the safety and education of Harry Potter was a shared responsibility of the coalition, not the guardianship of any one member or human institutional body. That the legal and financial architecture protecting Harry's rights and the Potter estate would be maintained and advanced by Gringotts in coordination with creature rights advocacy bodies already operating within the ministry framework. That the Forbidden Forest and the lands adjacent to it would be formally recognized as coalition territory for the purposes of any gathering or meeting, and that Hogwarts, while not directly opposed, was understood to be an institutional space under Dumbledore's authority and therefore not neutral ground. That each member faction would maintain its existing protective activities around Harry and coordinate through Rook as the convening authority, not because Rook commanded anyone but because everyone agreed his judgment was the clearest and his planning the longest in advance. And, this one was Harry's addition, and it had gone in after a debate that was mostly people agreeing with it once they stopped being surprised he proposed it, that the coalition would actively work to improve the conditions of all magical creature communities in Britain, not just those already represented. That this wouldn't be done by petition or complaint but by the slow, documented, legally rigorous accumulation of inarguable ground. Like water, Miriam had said, when Harry had described his thinking to her before the Parliament. She hadn't attended in person, stayed at the cottage, but had helped him think things through the evening before. Not storming the wall. Getting under it. Goblins know how to do that, Harry had said. Yes, she'd agreed. They really do. The pact was spoken. The sun touched the trees. Rook looked across the clearing at the assembled Parliament with the expression, Harry had learned to read it, of a centaur who had been looking at the stars for 170 years and had finally found the configuration he was expecting. Harry felt the coalition settle around him like something warm and very large and absolutely real. Not a cage. Not a chess pieces assigned square. Something alive, something he was part of rather than at the center of. He pressed his awareness outward in a way that was second nature now, easy, instinctive, like breathing, and felt it come back from every direction, warm and solid and certain. We are here. We hear you. We are not going anywhere. He breathed out slowly. Sable materialized beside him, stepping from the shadows as if the darkness had simply organized itself into her shape, and pressed her nose against his shoulder. He put his hand on her neck without looking. Good day. Cress asked, from his other side. Yes, he said. Then, did you know Hagrid was going to come? We expected someone. Hagrid was the best case. He's sad, Harry said. Not bad. Just, sad and caught. Cress looked at him sideways. Yes. That's an accurate reading. I think there are going to be more people like him. Not bad, just stuck in something they didn't build. Cress was quiet for a moment. Almost certainly. What do we do about them? Harry thought about it. Same as everything else, he said. Ask rather than tell. Leave room for them to move. He watched the centaur groups beginning to disperse at the far end of the clearing, their shapes going gold in the late light. You can't force someone to choose differently. You can just make the different choice available. Cress was quiet for long enough that Harry looked at her. She was looking at him with something in her dark eyes that he didn't have a word for yet. It was something between proud and something older and more complicated than pride, the expression of someone who had been right about something in a way that mattered more than being right usually did. Come on, she said, and her voice was even. Rook wants to debrief. And then we need to get you back to Miriam before she decides we've lost you and does something catastrophic to the Forbidden Forest wards. Harry almost smiled. She wouldn't. She absolutely would. I once saw her restructure a mountain's entire ward system in 40 minutes because a unicorn was upset. Harry did smile, then, and fell into step beside Cress as they moved across the clearing, and Sable followed like a shadow, and the October forest closed around them, and the last light turned everything briefly, brilliantly gold. The letter Hagrid sent to Dumbledore was honest, because Hagrid's letters always were. He wrote what he'd seen, what he'd heard, what Harry had said. He wrote it in his large, looping hand, with several crossings out where he tried to soften things and then decided that softening wasn't what the situation needed. He wrote, "He's well, Albus. He's more than well. He's got people around him, a lot of them, more than I expected, and they're proper people even if they're not wizards in the usual sense. He's being looked after. He's being taught. He said to tell you he'll meet you when he's ready. I know that's not what you wanted me to come back with. I think you need to hear it anyway. He looked me right in the eye, Albus. Same as James did. Same green eyes as Lily. He's not afraid of anything." Dumbledore read the letter twice. He set it down on his desk in the blue evening light of his office, among the silver spinning instruments and the portraits of old headmasters sleeping quietly in their frames. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the space above his desk, where Fawkes usually perched. The perch was empty. Fawkes had been increasingly absent over the past months, not gone, the bond didn't sever, but choosing to be elsewhere. He'd been doing it more and more since November of 1984, now that Dumbledore thought about it. Since November of a specific year and a specific night. Since the signal. He picked up his quill and held it and did not write anything. He was thinking about control and care and the difference between them, and he was finding, with the discomfort of a man of genuine intelligence confronting an uncomfortable truth, that the line between them was less clear than he had always assumed. He had always assumed the line was clear. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption that it was clear. He's not afraid of anything, Hagrid had written. He'd meant it as reassurance. Dumbledore read it as something else. A child with no fear of him, no natural gravitational pull toward his authority, was a variable he hadn't fully modeled. Everything he'd planned depended, at the root level, on Harry arriving at Hogwarts at 11 years old uncertain and eager and in need of guidance. Everything depended on the gratitude of a rescued child. He set down his quill. "I'll need to think about this differently," he said to himself, and the portrait slept on, and Fawkes stayed away, and the silver instruments spun their small quiet calculations in the blue light. Outside the window, so high up that even sharp eyes would have struggled to find it, a Thestral turned a wide, patient circle over Hogwarts and the forest below, its white eyes open in the dark. Watching. Chapter 4, The Education of Harry Potter. Monday started with a Kelpie trying to drown Miriam. It wasn't malicious, the Kelpie, whose name translated roughly from the old Watertongue as, the one who tests, and who Harry had been calling Gerald since March because it seemed to fit, had developed a complicated relationship with Miriam that involved approximately equal parts respect and provocation. Gerald tested everyone. It was simply what Kelpies did. The fact that Miriam had once restructured his entire territorial boundary without asking and then defended the decision by pointing out it was better for the water table made him respect her, but respect in Kelpie terms included regular reminders that the water belonged to the water. Harry was at the loch's edge eating breakfast when it happened. Miriam had gone in for an early swim, she did this even in October, which Harry found genuinely baffling, and had been doing laps along the north bank when Gerald surfaced directly beneath her and inverted her into the deep water. She came up 10 seconds later, already swearing in 3 languages, and Harry held out a piece of toast. "Don't," she said, swimming to the bank. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something." "I was going to ask if the swimming was good." She climbed out of the loch with the dignity of a woman who had made a decision about what her dignity meant and was sticking to it regardless of circumstances. Gerald surfaced again at the center of the loch, his equine head just visible, watching her with the placid satisfaction of a creature who had made his point. "He's getting faster," Harry said. "He's getting smarter," Miriam said, which she said in the tone of someone annoyed that the thing that was trying to drown them was clever about it. She took the towel Harry had ready without acknowledgement, which was her way of saying thank you. "Which is your fault?" "How is that my fault?" "Because he watches you working and the conversations you have with the water creatures have been modifying his behavior for 6 months. He's picked up your habit of testing people until he understands them." Harry looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Harry. "I don't test people," Harry said. "You absolutely test people. You just do it so quietly that most people don't notice until they've already answered." She wrung out her hair. "Get your wand. We have 3 things to cover before Rook gets here." 9 years old found Harry Potter long-limbed and serious-faced and possessed of a magical capability that Miriam had stopped measuring in comparative terms because she'd run out of comparisons. The wand she'd gotten him from an independent wand-maker in Edinburgh, not Ollivander, who reported to Dumbledore, but a woman named Catriona MacLeish who worked out of a building that wasn't on any street map and who had taken 3 hours with Harry and produced a wand of holly and phoenix feather 11 inches that she'd described, with professional understatement, as responsive, had been the last significant physical milestone. Everything else was internal. Everything else was relational, the way it had always been, just with 3 more years of depth and scale behind it. He could ward a building in 40 minutes that would have taken Miriam's full day. He could read the emotional signature of any living creature within roughly 200 meters. He could work wandlessly about 80% of the time for anything that didn't require sustained fine work, and the 20% that required the wand was trending down. He spoke to magical creatures in the old common tongue as naturally as breathing and had added functional gobbledygook, Ragnar had insisted, and turned out to be a surprisingly patient teacher, and enough murmish to hold a basic conversation underwater, which had delighted the loch's kelpie-adjacent residents and faintly alarmed Gerald. What he could not do, and what Miriam was periodically firm about, he could not yet manage the sustained complex magic of dueling at an advanced level. Not because the power wasn't there, the power was spectacularly there, but because combat magic required a specific discipline of output control that was the hardest thing for him to develop. His magic wanted to respond relationally, wanted to listen first, and combat didn't allow for listening first. He was working on it. Miriam had opinions. Again, she said, standing across the meadow from him on a Tuesday morning in early May, the Highland spring making the air smell impossibly clean. This time when I come at you, don't ask the shield to hold. Tell it. That's not how I work, Harry said, for approximately the 14th time in 2 weeks. I know it's not how you work. That's why we're practicing it. She had her wand up, the casual ready stance of someone who was genuinely expert. There are going to be situations where asking takes a quarter second too long. I need you to have both options. Asking is faster for me. Asking is faster for normal targets. For something that doesn't have a will to cooperate, dark magic, an object, a purely physical force, asking gives you nothing to work with. She moved, and the spell came fast, not hurting fast. They didn't practice with anything that could do permanent harm, but fast enough to require real reflexes. Harry's shield went up. It held. It was, objectively, an excellent shield, layered, flexible, the kind of shield that absorbed and redirected rather than simply blocking. Miriam hit it with 2 follow-up spells before it settled, and both spells curved around the shield's edge and dissipated in the meadow grass. She lowered her wand. Good shield. Thank you. Took you a 1/5 of a second longer than it should have. It held 3 spells. Against something that wanted to end you, that 1/5 of a second is the whole story. She lowered her wand fully. I'm not telling you your way is wrong. I'm telling you it needs a supplement. You need both. He thought about this in the way he thought about her harder arguments, not defensive, genuinely trying it on for fit. What if I command the structure and ask the response, he said. Tell the shield to exist, ask it how to move. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Show me. He showed her. The shield that went up was different from his previous ones. It had a backbone, a commanded structure, but the surface moved and responded in a relational way rather than the fixed way, fluid like water held in a shaped container. When she hit it with 3 simultaneous spells, it didn't just deflect, it read the spell intentions and reshaped itself around each one before they arrived. Miriam stood very still. How does that feel? Harry asked. It feels like someone solved a problem I've been working on for 15 years, she said, and her voice had the careful flatness of someone being very professional about something that was moving them considerably. Again. They practiced until lunch. By the time they stopped, the shield had evolved through 4 more iterations, and Harry had also inadvertently invented what Miriam described as, functionally, a new class of defensive casting, which she wrote up in 3 pages that evening and sent to both Rook and Ragnar with a note that said, I need someone to tell me if this already exists in any non-human magical tradition before I write the paper. Rook replied, it does not. Write the paper. Ragnar replied, patent it first. The dragon poaching ring had been operating in the Scottish Highlands for at least 18 months before Miriam found evidence of it, and she'd found the evidence by accident. A Hebridean black had appeared at the cottage's ley-line border in February, badly injured, trailing the particular magical residue that came from ministry-grade containment spells. She'd treated the dragon's wounds with the specific, organized competence she brought to everything medical and sent it back into the mountains, and then she'd spent 3 months quietly tracing the residue back to its source. The source was a ring of 7 poachers operating with ministry exemption licenses that had been issued by a mid-level Department of Magical Law Enforcement official named Carveth Aldous, who had a property in Inverness, 3 offshore accounts that Ragnarok had identified by their vault signatures in about 40 minutes, and direct connections to 2 Wisengamot members who were known to have voted against every creature rights bill in the past decade. "It's not just the money," Miriam told Harry on the Thursday before the operation, laying out the documentation on the kitchen table. 3 years of careful coalition intelligence work had produced a picture that was much larger than individual poaching. Dragon blood. Dragon scales. Dragon heartstring. They're supplying a potions trade that runs through at least 4 apothecary chains and ends up in, she pointed to a name Harry recognized, Malfoy-associated trading companies. "So it connects to Death Eater networks," Harry said. "Through commercial distance." "But yes." He studied the map. The main operation was based at a facility in the Cairngorms, a valley site that had been warded against casual detection, which was why the Coalition's Highland network had taken this long to identify it precisely. When? Saturday morning. The facility is staffed on rotation, smallest staff on Saturday, 4 people. The dragons are held in a temporary containment in the Eastern Valley. She met his eyes. "This is a removal operation, not a raid. We go in, we document everything. Ragnarok's team needs the documentation for the Wisengamot complaint, we get the dragons out, and we leave. We don't fight anyone if we don't have to. And if we have to." She looked at him steadily. "Then we do." "But Harry, these aren't Voldemort's inner circle. These are people doing a job for money. They don't need to be destroyed. They need to be exposed." "I understand the difference," he said. "I'm not going to hurt anyone who isn't actively trying to hurt me or the dragons." "I know." She looked back at the map. "That's why I'm bringing you." They went at dawn, just the 2 of them, with Sable providing air support and 3 of Rook's fastest Centaur scouts positioned at the valley's entry points as watchers. No coalition military presence, this wasn't that kind of operation, and the moment it became that kind of operation it stopped being intelligence gathering and started being something the Ministry could characterize as aggression. The line mattered. The valley was 2 miles north of the Cairngorm's highest point, tucked between ridges in a way that made it invisible from the air unless you were a Thestral who could see through the visual suppression charms. Sable had mapped the ward perimeter 3 days earlier and Harry had spent 2 evenings analyzing it, and what he'd found was what he expected from ministry-grade commercial work, technically competent, standardized, not adapted to the specific terrain. The wards were designed for a generic site. This site wasn't generic. "The eastern ridge has a natural ward break," he told Miriam. "Where the granite shelf intrudes. The ward was designed on a flat terrain model and the stones disrupting the lower layer. There's a seam about 18 inches wide. Big enough for me to widen it." "Yes." The widening took 11 minutes, crouched at the ridge base in the pre-dawn cold, working the ward seam with the careful sustained attention of someone who was asking the stone and the ward to cooperate with each other rather than fighting them into compliance. The stone was very agreeable. The ward didn't fight because he wasn't fighting it, he was persuading its edges that the seam was where they naturally wanted to be. It widened smoothly, silently, without the magical signature flare that forcing it would have produced. "That was extraordinary," Miriam said, beside him, very quietly. "The stone helped," Harry said. "I know. That's the extraordinary part." She moved through the gap and he followed. The facility was a set of 3 structures in the valley's flat center, prefabricated magical construction, the kind that could be assembled and disassembled in hours. 2 were storage and processing. 1 was containment. The containment structure was the one that mattered, and it was the one Harry could feel from 50 meters away. The dragon's presence registered as something vast and hot and deeply furious, compressed into inadequate space. 2 guards were visible at the main structure. 1 more, Miriam indicated with a hand signal, somewhere on the far side. They moved through the valley's morning shadow, keeping to the ridge line, and Harry was doing something continuously as they moved, broadcasting on the frequency he'd developed for creature communication, a targeted send rather than the wide broadcast of his childhood. I am here. I know you are here. I am coming to help. Please be as quiet as you can manage. The containment structure responded, not in words, but in the way the quality of the furious heat changed. It didn't diminish. Dragons didn't diminish. But it waited, in the way that intelligent fury sometimes waits when something it doesn't understand presents itself. They reached the containment structure's access panel. Miriam assessed the lock. Harry put his hand flat on the panel and felt the structure, the lock, the ward seal, the hinge mechanism, and said to it, in the old common tongue, very quietly, "Open." It opened. The smell hit immediately, smoke and scale and something older, something geological, the particular scent of creatures who have been on the earth since before the distinction between fire and stone was clear. 3 Hebridean blacks in containment pens that were criminally inadequate, pacing, the nearest one turning its enormous head toward Harry as he stepped in and focusing on him with eyes that were amber gold and very intelligent. Harry looked back at it. "Hello," he said, in the old tongue. The dragon was silent for a long moment. Then it made a sound, low, not quite a growl, something more like a very large purr with geological undertones, and pressed its head against the containment barrier. "I know," Harry said. "We're getting you out." Miriam was already at the first pen's lock, working with the focus speed she brought to everything practical. Harry moved to the second, put his hand on it, opened it. Third. 2 minutes total. The dragons were out of their pens and moving toward the structure's far end, where Miriam had identified a removal panel large enough for passage. That was when the guard from the far side of the main structure came around the corner and saw them. He was in his 30s, broad, wore the kind of work-hardened look of someone who did dangerous jobs and had gotten comfortable with the danger. He had his wand out in a reflex so fast it was almost automatic. "Stop," he said. "Right there." Harry stopped. Miriam stopped. The dragons did not stop, because Harry had told them to keep moving toward the exit and they had correctly understood this as the higher priority instruction and he wasn't countermanding it. The guard's eyes went from Harry and Miriam to the moving dragons and back, trying to process too many things at once. "Get back," he said, to the dragons. "Get, Accio containment, don't," Harry said. The guard looked at him. Looked at the 9-year-old boy in the pre-dawn shadow of a highland valley looking back at him with green eyes that were, in this light, very calm and very direct. "You're a kid," the guard said, which people sometimes said when they encountered Harry in operational contexts and couldn't immediately integrate the information. "Yes," Harry said. "And you're someone doing a job for people who are committing an offense under the Magical Creatures Protection Act of 1972, the Gringotts Ministry Accord of 1947 as it applies to creature asset rights, and 3 separate Wisengamot statutes that my associate will happily list if you want them listed." He paused. "We're not here for you. We're here for them." He indicated the dragons. "You can stop us, or you can let us go, but stopping us involves a fight that you will lose and that will result in all of the documentation we've assembled about this operation being delivered to the Ministry, Gringotts, and the Daily Prophet simultaneously tomorrow morning either way. So stopping us doesn't actually protect anyone. It just adds assault on a minor to the list of things that need to be explained." The guard stared at him. The 2 other guards had heard the commotion and appeared at the main structure's corner. They took in the scene, 2 intruders, 3 freed dragons moving toward the exit, and their colleague standing with his wand pointed at a small boy who appeared to be the least concerned person in the valley. "What is happening?" one of them said. "A choice," Miriam said pleasantly, from Harry's left, her wand appearing from nowhere with absolute casualness. "One of 2 outcomes. We'd recommend the one that doesn't involve paperwork." The first guard lowered his wand. It wasn't defeat, exactly. It was the expression of someone who had done the math with reasonable speed and arrived at the sensible answer. "Who are you?" he said to Harry. "Not relevant," Harry said. "Your employer is Carveth Aldous." He works with Malfoy Trading. The documentation went to Gringotts this morning regardless of what happens here, that was always happening. Today is just about the dragons. He looked at the guard steadily. Consider your options for what comes next. There are better jobs. He turned and walked toward the exit. Miriam fell into step beside him. The dragons were already through, their shapes moving up the valley slope toward the ridge, and Sable was visible above, a black arc against the dawn sky, banking in a slow circle that was equal parts surveillance and something celebratory. None of the guards followed. They cleared the valley in 12 minutes. Harry found the dragons on the ridge's far side, already orienting themselves toward the mountains, shaking off the residue of the containment spells with the bodily commitment of creatures reclaiming their own space. The nearest one, the one he'd spoken to inside, turned its head toward him one final time. He held up his hand. Not a wave. Just acknowledgement. The dragon made the geological purr again, brief and certain, and then turned and followed the others up the mountain slope and was gone into the morning. Miriam stood beside him watching them go. 3 Hebridean blacks returned to the wild, she said. Evidence documented. 0 casualties. 0 permanent magical signatures left at the scene. The ward seam is still open, Harry said. I sealed it on the way out. He looked at her. When? While you were having your conversation with the guard. She almost smiled. I can do more than one thing at a time. He didn't say anything for a moment. They stood on the ridge in the cold morning with the mountains around them and Sable descending in a long glide from above and the whole highland morning smelling exactly like itself. Miriam. Was the guard telling the truth when he said he didn't know about the Malfoy connection? She was quiet for a second. His voice frequency said yes. His hand movement said he'd heard the name and didn't ask questions. She paused. Does it matter? Not for the operation. Maybe for, he stopped. I don't want to be in the business of deciding who knew what they were part of and who didn't. That gets complicated. Yes, she said. It does. That's one of the reasons we document instead of judge. Let someone else have that argument with the evidence we provide. She looked at him. Good operation. You said that already. I'm saying it again. It was good. She started walking back down the ridge toward the longer path home. Also, you need to eat something before Rook arrives. He's going to want a full debrief and you always get short-tempered when you're hungry and pretend you don't. I don't get short-tempered. You absolutely get short-tempered. You just do it very quietly so people think it's thoughtfulness. Sable landed beside him, dropping the last 10 feet with the Thestrals' characteristic gravity-optional relationship to descents, and pushed her nose against his shoulder. He leaned into her briefly, one hand on her neck, and felt the network warm around him, Rook's amber glow from the forest, the Grindylows' quick rattle from the home lock 3 miles away, the mountain air and the morning. Come on, he said to Sable. Race you to the bottom. She was already running. Rook's debrief that afternoon covered the operation, the goblin filing, and what Rook had begun calling the accelerating situation, which was his measured way of describing Voldemort's return gathering momentum in Eastern Europe. The intelligence was fragmentary, Centaur networks didn't cover the continent comprehensively, but what came through was consistent, followers regrouping, the dark signature strengthening, movement toward Britain. How long? Harry asked. The stars are unclear about time. Clear about direction. Rook looked at his maps. Within the next 4 years, almost certainly. Within 2, possibly. He'll come for me, Harry said. Not dramatically. Just accounting for facts. That's the assumption. The prophecy, neither can live while the other survives, Harry said. Yes. I know. He'd known since he was 7, had read it from Miriam's notes rather than having it told to him ceremonially, and had processed it with the same attention he gave everything. So we keep building. When he comes he'll come expecting whatever Dumbledore's told him about me, a dependent child, protected by blood magic, not much else. Rook was very still. He'll come expecting something weak, Harry said. He should find something different. Yes, Rook said. He should. Miriam and I have been working on the combat structure. I think I can adapt the shield work into offensive applications. Don't get ahead of your training, Rook said, which was the closest he got to be careful. I'm not. I'm planning. Harry looked at the maps. The prophecy says neither can live while the other survives. It doesn't say how it happens. It doesn't say who has allies. It doesn't say anything about the magical ecology of Britain standing between us. Rook looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. It doesn't. Harry rolled up the map. Then we have time to do this right. What else? Wednesdays belonged to Ragnarok. They had a standing arrangement. The Goblin Council chamber at Gringotts had a private floor that connected directly to the cottage's fireplace, which was a modification that had required considerable negotiation with the building's ancient ward system and which Ragnarok had characterized as an investment in future institutional relationships, when the other council members questioned the expense. Wednesdays at 2 in the afternoon, Ragnarok's head appeared in the fireplace and they talked. Sometimes it was the estate. Sometimes it was the legal strategy. Sometimes, increasingly, as Harry's gobbledygook improved, it was financial architecture. The Potter family vault contained resources that had been frozen and accruing since 1981, and Ragnarok had opinions about what should be done with them that aligned almost perfectly with what Harry had started to develop his own opinions about. The Malfoy trading connection from Saturday's operation, Ragnarok said on the following Wednesday, his head in the fireplace flames, a cup of something beside him that steamed green. I filed the documentation this morning. 3 Wisengamot members are going to have uncomfortable weeks. How uncomfortable? Investigative committee uncomfortable. Not prosecuted uncomfortable, not yet. But visible. Publicly visible. Which is better, for our purposes? Ragnarok sipped his drink. Prosecution means a trial that Dumbledore can influence. Visibility means the Daily Prophet, which Dumbledore cannot currently influence because he and Rita Skeeter are not on speaking terms. Harry filed this. Skeeter was someone Ragnarok had mentioned twice in passing and both times with the tone of someone who had found a tool they weren't entirely comfortable using but weren't going to put down either. What's her interest in this? Money. Notoriety. She smells a story bigger than anything she's currently working on. Ragnarok set down his cup. She doesn't know the whole picture. She knows there's something involving the Potter estate, ministry corruption, and creature rights that's been building for 3 years and that someone has been very systematically assembling evidence about. She's been making inquiries. A pause. I've been answering some of them. Carefully. Harry thought about this. You're feeding her. I'm providing accurate information through unofficial channels to a journalist who will publish it accurately because she's more interested in the story being big than in it being filtered. Ragnarok's expression was professionally neutral. It's not manipulation. It's institutional communication through the most effective available medium. That's a very Goblin description of manipulation. Yes, Ragnarok said, without inflection. How is your gobbledygook coming? Better than last week. I understood the contracts you sent on Monday without the glossary. The financial contracts or the property ones? Both. Ragnarok made the sharp click sound that was Goblin approval. Good. Next week we cover the inheritance law modifications that Dumbledore's Wisengamot allies pushed through in 1983. There are 3 clauses that need challenging and I want you to understand why before I file the challenge, because you'll be the one the court asks about them if it goes to a hearing. I'll be ready. I know you will be. The fire flickered. Ragnarok looked at him through the flames with his sharp, old eyes. One more thing. The guard at Saturday's facility, the one you spoke to. Harry waited. His name is Torvald Fenwick. He handed himself into the ministry yesterday morning and provided a full testimony about the operation structure, the Malfoy connection, and the names of the Wisingamot members involved in licensing the exemptions. Ragnarok paused. His testimony corroborates our documentation on every material point. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the guard's face, the calculation, the lowered wand. He chose the better option, he said. He did. Ragnarok looked at him. Whatever you said to him in that valley was effective. I just told him the truth about his choices. Yes. Ragnarok picked up his cup again. That is, in my considerable experience, the most effective thing one can do. It is also the rarest. He drank. Same time next Wednesday. The fire went out. Harry sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, in the late afternoon light coming through the window, and felt the week settle around him, the dragons on the mountain, the testimony filed, the documents delivered, the 3 Wisingamot members with their uncomfortable weeks ahead of them. All of it connected, all of it part of the same patient architecture that Rook had started building with letters 3 years ago and that Ragnarok was fortifying with legal precision and that Miriam was making possible by teaching Harry to be someone worth building around. Not a symbol. Not a chosen one. Just a 9-year-old boy in a Highland kitchen who knew how to ask things rather than command them and had spent 5 years learning that the world answered when you asked it right. He got up and started making dinner before Miriam came in from the lock, because she'd been in a meeting with the Kelpie Network all afternoon and the Kelpie Network was exhausting in a specific way and she always needed food before she could properly talk. He knew this the way he knew everything about the people he lived with, not through analysis but through attention, the same attention he gave the wardstones and the weather and the dragons and everything else. The cottage smelled like the coming rain and the peat fire and the particular warm alive smell of a place where things mattered. Outside, through the kitchen window, the Highland evening was going amber over the loch. Sable was a dark moving shape above the water. Gerald surfaced at the loch center and looked at the cottage and looked at the sky and went back down, satisfied that everything was in its right place. Harry stirred the pot. Thursday evening. Miriam was reading. Harry was at the table with Rook's star maps and his own notes, cross-referencing the Centaur stellar readings with what Ragnarok's wardstones had been registering over the past month. He developed a hypothesis about the correlation between Voldemort's increasing activity and the wardstone anomaly patterns and wanted to see if the star data supported it. Gerald surfaced once at the loch and went back down. The Bowtruckles and the Rowan were quiet. Miriam, Harry said. She turned a page. When I was in the cupboard. He said it the way he said everything real, just directly, without working up to it. I cried. That's what sent the signal. Yes. I don't remember being afraid of everything after that. After the signal went out and they answered. I remember being less afraid of everything. He looked at the star maps. Does that make sense? That being heard made me less afraid of everything, not just the immediate thing. Miriam put down her book. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes had that was warmer than her usual careful professional register, the expression she seemed to think she had better than she did. Yes, she said. It makes complete sense. Isolation is the thing that makes fear grow. Not the scary thing itself. The aloneness with it. He nodded slowly. So when Voldemort comes, you won't be alone with it, she said, very simply. That's the whole strategy. That's what Rook's been building and Ragnarok's been formalizing and what this, she gestured at the cottage, at the window, at the loch and the Rowan and everything beyond them, what all of this is. You don't fight him from isolation. You fight him from here. From all of this. A pause. And you fight him as yourself, not as the person anyone else needed you to be. He held her eyes. Were you scared? When you were 16 and they expelled you? She was quiet for a moment. I was terrified, she said, honestly. And furious. Mostly furious. She almost smiled. And then I found the mountains. And the unicorn herd. And eventually rook. And she stopped, choosing the word. I got rooted. That's the word. I stopped being afraid because I was rooted somewhere that was mine. This is mine, Harry said. She looked at him for a long moment, and the professional distance she maintained like a tool, the careful separateness that was not coldness but was something protective, it moved, briefly, and what was under it was simple and real and very clear. Yes, she said. It is. She picked her book back up. He turned back to the star maps. Outside, the Highland rain came in off the loch, steady and clean, the kind of rain that knew exactly what it was doing. Friday morning. A letter arrived from Hagrid, the third in 6 months, each one longer than the last, full of stories about James and Lily that arrived in Harry's life like gifts he hadn't known he was owed. He read it at breakfast, the way he always read Hagrid's letters, slowly, taking everything in, letting it build the picture. Hagrid wrote about his parents the way people write about things they loved, with specificity, with humor, with the particular gravity of someone who understood that memory was the only ongoing presence of the lost. His father in Transfiguration, turning his teacher's desk into a fully functional boat and then expressing genuine confusion that this was a problem. His mother laughing at something in the library at 11 at night and the laugh carrying all the way to the Gryffindor common room. His father on a broomstick. His mother arguing with a potions textbook that she was convinced had an error on page 394. Harry put the letter down and looked at the lock for a while. He'd cried once, reading Hagrid's letters, the first one, which had contained a photograph of the three of them, James and Lily and baby Harry in James's arms, all three laughing at something outside the frame. He'd cried privately, in the rowan tree's branches, with the bowtruckles giving him the space they'd learned to give him when he needed it. He didn't feel robbed, exactly. He'd been too young to remember what was taken. What he felt was something more like hunger, the specific hunger of wanting to know the people you came from, to understand the shape of the life you were supposed to have had. It didn't make him smaller. It made him more certain about what mattered. He wrote back to Hagrid. He always wrote back. He asked about the boat desk transfiguration and whether his father had ever actually explained what he was trying to accomplish. He asked if his mother had been right about page 394. He signed it Harry, not Harry Potter, not because the name was a burden but because Hagrid knew who he was without the whole construction. He folded the letter and addressed it and put it in the spot by the door where Miriam's post owl collected outgoing mail. Then he went to find Sable, because the morning was clear and Friday mornings when the weather was clear were flying mornings and everything else could wait. Sable was at the loch's eastern shore, which was their spot, the bank where the stone shelf angled out over the water and gave her room to take off and him room to mount without either of them doing anything undignified. She heard him coming while he was still 50 meters away and turned her head with those white eyes, and the thing that moved in her face when she saw him had no human equivalent but translated clearly as "there you are." He ran the last 10 meters because that seemed appropriate and she flicked her wing at him in the tolerant way she had that meant "you're ridiculous and also fine," and he vaulted onto her back with the ease of 3 years of practice and she was already moving before he'd settled, that 3-step run and then the wings snapping open and the ground leaving. The Highlands at 9 years old on a clear May morning were something that had no adequate language. The loch dropped below them, silver in the early light, and Gerald surfaced briefly and looked up, and the bowtruckles in the rowan were tiny pale shapes, and the cottage was small and warm-looking, and the mountains went on in every direction, enormous and permanent in theirs. Sable found a thermal over the eastern ridge and banked into it, and they climbed, spiraling, until the air was thin and cold and the world below was a map. Harry spread his arms out from his sides, feeling the altitude in his chest, and sent the warm broadcast pulse outward, "All of you, all of it, I'm here," and felt the network answer from below, Rook's amber glow from the south, Ragnarok's precise wardstone signature, Miriam's particular magical signature, sharp and complex like something with an interesting smell, and the Grindylows and Gerald and the Centaur scouts on the southern perimeter and everything that was his and he was part of. He was 9 years old. He had a year until Hogwarts age. He had Voldemort somewhere in the direction of east and growing. He had Dumbledore somewhere in the direction of south and watching. He had all of this. He leaned forward against Sable's neck as she tipped into a dive, the wind screaming past them, the lock rushing up, and he laughed the way he'd laughed on the first flight from Surrey, full and unguarded and absolutely free, and Sable leveled out 10 feet above the water, their reflection racing alongside them, and the morning broke open golden ahead of them. Chapter 5, Dumbledore's Gambit. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a Tuesday in July, which was the kind of ordinary detail that made the thing feel stranger. Harry was on the cottage roof fixing a section of thatch that the Highland wind had disagreed with, and the letter came via a school owl that had clearly been given precise instructions and was very pleased with itself about finding a property that had 30 layers of misdirection wards on it. It landed on the roof beside him with the satisfaction of a creature that had completed a difficult job. He looked at the envelope. Green ink. His name and the cottage address written with the certainty of an institution that expected to be listened to. Mr. H. Potter, The Croft by Loch Aird, Cairngorms, Inverness Shire. He picked it up, turned it over, looked at the Hogwarts seal. Then he climbed down from the roof and went inside. Miriam was at the table with a cup of tea and a set of ward theory texts she'd been annotating for the past week. She looked at the letter. She looked at Harry. She said nothing. Harry opened it, read it, set it down. It's real, he said. Of course it's real. You knew it was coming. Knowing and seeing are different things. He sat down across from her. The letter sat between them on the table, the standard Hogwarts invitation, book lists, equipment requirements, the train platform details for September 1st. Normal in every way that mattered institutionally. He's been preparing for this for years. The Weasleys will be approached. McGonagall might come herself. Someone will make the soft contact play before he tries anything official. Probably. Miriam turned her tea mug in her hands. What do you want to do? Harry looked at the letter. I want to go to Hogwarts, he said. She was very still. Not because Dumbledore wants me there. Because it's the best magical school in Britain and I want an education that isn't just us. He met her eyes. You've given me something extraordinary. I know that. But there are things a school gives you that a cottage doesn't, peers, institutional knowledge, the experience of being in a place where magic has been practiced for 1,000 years. He paused. And because I'm not going to spend my life avoiding Dumbledore's spaces. That's a cage too. Miriam was quiet for a long moment. He'll try to manage you the moment you walk through the door. I know. He'll use the school structure, the house system, the other students, professor relationships, everything he has available, to try to redirect you back to what he planned. I know. You're not afraid of that. No. Harry looked at the letter again. I'm genuinely not. Because everything he planned was based on a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. He's been preparing for a frightened, isolated child who needs him. I'm not that. He turned the letter over in his hands. I'm curious about what happens when he meets what I actually am. Miriam looked at him for a long time with that expression that lived somewhere between professional assessment and something warmer. I'll write to Rook, she said finally. And Ragnarok will want to know. There are legal preparations to make before September. Tell Rook I want to talk to him directly. This week if possible. She nodded. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his, quick, certain, the way she did everything, and then picked up her quill. Go finish the roof, she said. The weather holds for 2 more days and that thatch isn't going to fix itself. He went back up to the roof. The owl was still there, waiting for a reply. He looked at it. Tell them yes, he said. The owl left. Rook came the following day, arriving in the early afternoon from the south with 2 centaur scouts and the particular focused energy he carried when he was thinking about multiple things at once and had organized them into a sequence. He sat with Harry at the loch's edge while Miriam gave them space, and they talked for 2 hours with the directness that had always characterized them. Rook listened to Harry's reasoning without interrupting. When Harry finished, he said, "The castle itself." Harry waited. "The castle is a magical entity," Rook said. "Not in the way a living creature is, but not simply stone and mortar either. It has a consciousness of sorts, accumulated, layered, the residue of 1,000 years of magic practiced inside it. It knows things. It responds to things." He was looking at the lock. "Hogwarts Castle felt your signal. In November of 1984. When all of us felt it." Harry turned this over. "The castle felt me. The castle has been waiting," Rook said, "in the way that old things wait, without urgency, without impatience. Buildings don't have those. But there is a quality of attention to a place that has been tended well, and Hogwarts, whatever else it is, has been tended by extraordinary magic for a very long time." He looked at Harry. "You will be entering a space that recognizes you. Before Dumbledore has a chance to frame what you are, the castle will have already decided." "Decided what?" Rook was quiet for a moment. "That you belong there. Not by Dumbledore's permission. By the castle's own assessment." Harry sat with the lock's particular Tuesday afternoon quality and the weight of this. Then he said, "And the sorting?" "The sorting hat is old," Rook said. "Older than Dumbledore's tenure by 900 years. It has its own judgment. It cannot be instructed to place you somewhere." "Has Dumbledore tried?" Another pause. "He has expressed preferences. Strongly. The hat operates by its own criteria." He glanced at Harry. "Stop worrying about the hat. The hat will do what the hat does." "I wasn't worried," Harry said. "I was planning. There's very little difference in your case." Ragnar's response to the news arrived by special Gringotts courier, a goblin on a very fast broomstick who appeared to have flown directly from London and had strong feelings about the journey, with a package of documents and a letter that was characteristically dense and thorough and covered 6 pages. The summary was this: Ragnar had been preparing for Hogwarts since Harry was 7. The legal groundwork was complete. The Potter estate arrangement had been restructured so that Gringotts held independent trustee status, meaning Dumbledore's previous informal oversight of Harry's finances was now formally displaced by an institution with binding legal obligations. Any attempt to limit Harry's access to his own resources, redirect his educational trust, or use financial leverage as a control mechanism would constitute a Gringotts contract violation with consequences that Ragnar described as significant and public. Furthermore, the 3 Wisengamot members identified in the dragon poaching operation had, over the past 18 months, been steadily losing their committee positions through the patient application of documented evidence supplied to investigative bodies. 2 had resigned voluntarily. 1 had not and was currently facing a formal inquiry. The result was a Wisengamot that was 3 votes closer to a functional majority on creature rights legislation and 3 votes less aligned with Dumbledore's interest bloc. And furthermore, Rita Skeeter had published 4 articles in the past year through Ragnar's careful management of information flow. None of them mentioned Harry. All of them created a public context, ministry corruption, creature mistreatment, institutional overreach, that shaped the narrative space in which Harry's arrival at Hogwarts would be received. The last page of Ragnar's letter said, "Come to Gringotts before September. I want to see you in person before you walk into that school. There are things I want to say to you that are not suitable for written correspondence." Harry went to Gringotts in August. London was extraordinary and overwhelming in specific ways that Harry had not fully anticipated and would not admit had caught him off guard. He'd been to the village near the cottage and to Edinburgh twice, but London was a different scale entirely, the particular chaos of the city landing on him all at once, the million individual magical and non-magical signatures overlapping into a kind of static that he had to consciously filter. Miriam walked beside him through the leaky cauldron's dim interior and he was aware of her watching him process the volume. "All right," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then, it's loud. The crowd or the magic?" "Both. Together." He adjusted his internal filter the way she'd taught him, narrowing the reception from everything within 200 meters to everything within 5, and the static dropped to manageable. Better. The Leaky Cauldron's patrons had looked at him with the particular quality of people recognizing a face they expected to see on someone older. He'd felt it, the stares, the caught breaths, the whispered name moving through the room. He hadn't acknowledged any of it. He looked straight ahead and walked straight through, and if any of it landed on him it didn't show. Diagon Alley was better, more space, more sky, the magical signatures more distributed. He looked at it with the absorbed attention he gave new environments and let himself actually see it, the shop fronts, the magical economy of a place that had been conducting its business openly for centuries, the particular layered quality of so much old magic in a concentrated area. He bought his school supplies with Miriam, efficiently. He was not effusive about it. He was precise and interested in a way that shopkeepers responded to. The woman at Flourish and Blots gave him 3 additional books that weren't on the Hogwarts list because he asked genuinely good questions about the classification system, and she found this refreshing. Madame Malkin measured his robes and was professional and quick. The apothecary was fascinating in a way he could have spent 3 hours in, and Miriam limited him to 45 minutes, which he thought was generous actually. He bought his own wand supplies even though he had a wand, Catriona McLeish's Hollyann Phoenix Feather, which was excellent and which he wasn't changing, because there were things in the ingredient stock that he'd been wanting for ward theory experimentation, and this was the easiest place to get them. Gringotts was last. Ragnarok met him in a private chamber below the main banking floor, not the grand public spaces, but a room that had been used for significant meetings for approximately 300 years and knew it. It had the feeling of a space that had witnessed important things and had formed opinions about them. Harry sat across from Ragnarok at the stone table and felt the room's weight and found it honest. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You're taller than last time. It's been 8 months. Yes." Ragnarok folded his hands on the table. "I want to say something to you before you go into that school and the world becomes complicated in new ways. Will you hear it?" "Yes," Harry said. "Your parents' vault contains enough gold to fund a small country's annual defense budget. Your family name is the most politically significant in Wizarding Britain. The prophecy marks you as the necessary actor in the most consequential event in a generation." Ragnarok held his eyes. "None of that is what makes you worth protecting. Do you understand that?" Harry was quiet. "We did not build this," Ragnarok said, and gestured, at the room, at everything beyond it, because of prophecy. "We did not build it because of gold. We built it because a 4-year-old child cried alone in the dark and the whole living world of Britain heard it and found it intolerable." He paused. "That child is still the reason. Whatever you become in that school, whatever they make of you, whatever Dumbledore frames you as, the child who cried and was heard is the whole point. Don't lose him inside the other things." Harry held the goblin's gaze across the stone table. He felt the room's 300 years of witnessing settle around them. "I won't," he said. Ragnarok nodded once, sharp and certain. Then he opened a folder in front of him and said, "Good. Now. The Inheritance Law Modifications of 1983. We need to discuss 3 specific clauses before you appear in any legal forum." They worked for 2 hours. When Harry left Gringotts, the London sky was going orange and Miriam was waiting on the steps with a meat pie from a vendor and the expression of a woman who had managed her impatience for 2 hours and was done. "How was he?" she asked. Harry took the meat pie. "Good," he said. "He told me not to lose myself." "Did he?" "In his way." "Yes." She looked at him sideways as they walked back toward the Leaky Cauldron. "Are you going to?" He thought about it with genuine consideration, because it was a real question and deserved a real answer. "No," he said. "I spent too long figuring out what I am. I'm not going to put it down for anyone." Dumbledore made 4 distinct moves in August. The first was through the Weasley family. Arthur Weasley, who was warm and well-meaning and had the kind of fundamental decency that made him useful to people who had less of it, was quietly encouraged by a mutual friend to invite Harry to spend time at the Burrow before school began. It was delicately done, not a command, just a suggestion, the kind of social warmth that was hard to read as anything other than kindness. Harry declined politely through Miriam and sent back a note expressing genuine interest in meeting them at school. The second was McGonagall. She came to the cottage in the second week of August, alone, which Harry respected. She didn't send someone else. She came herself, walking up the path from the loch's south shore with her characteristic precise stride, and she knocked on the cottage door and stood there in her traveling robes, and when Harry opened the door she looked at him for a moment with something complicated in her expression and then said, "Mr. Potter. I'm Professor McGonagall. I'm the head of Gryffindor House and the Transfiguration Professor at Hogwarts. I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." "Come in," Harry said. "I'll put the kettle on." Miriam was conspicuously absent, which meant she'd gone down to the loch but was almost certainly within perception range. Harry made tea and brought it to the table and sat across from McGonagall and looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression he would later identify as her specifically in moments of emotional management, not cold, not hard, but held. She looked at him and then around the cottage, at the bookshelves and the wardwork and the evidence of 5 years of real education in every corner of the room. Something moved in her face. "You're well," she said, and it wasn't a pleasantry. It was an assessment, and relief was audible in it. "Yes," Harry said. "I visited Privet Drive in 1981, she said, which was not what he'd expected her to open with. "The day before Dumbledore placed you there. I sat outside and watched. I saw your aunt, your cousin." She stopped. "I had concerns. I expressed them." She stopped again. He explained the blood ward necessity and the protection it provided. He was very thorough. Very convincing. A pause. "I let myself be convinced." Harry looked at her. He felt the weight of what she was carrying, the specific weight of someone who had known something was wrong and had found reasons not to act on it and had been finding reasons for a decade. He didn't perform sympathy. He just said, "I know." She looked up. "I know you weren't in favor of it," Harry said. "Miriam did research. Found the correspondence. You wrote to Dumbledore twice in the first year expressing concern." He held her gaze steadily. "You were overruled. That's different from agreeing." McGonagall's composure shifted very slightly. One very slight shift, quickly controlled. "I should have done more." "Probably," Harry said, because she was being honest and honesty deserved honest back. "But you're here now. That matters too." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "What did Dumbledore ask you to do?" She set down her own mug. "Assess the situation. Meet you. Report back." She said it plainly, which was the quality that made him respect her in the first 60 seconds. "He wants to understand what he's working with before September." "I know," Harry said. "What will you tell him?" McGonagall looked at him for a long moment, at this 11-year-old across the table who had asked what will you tell him instead of please don't tell him anything, who had used the phrasing as a genuine inquiry rather than an appeal. Something decided in her expression. "I'll tell him the truth," she said. "That you're healthy and well-educated and clearly competent. That you have a network of support around you that I don't fully understand the scope of." She paused. "And that you know exactly what you're walking into." "Good," Harry said. "That's useful information for him to have." "You want him to know?" "I want him to adjust his expectations before we're in the same room," Harry said. "It'll save time." McGonagall looked at him with an expression that was 1 part professionally appropriate and 3 parts something she was very firmly not going to allow herself to show. She picked up her tea. "What are you interested in learning at Hogwarts?" "Academically." They talked for an hour. She asked real questions and he gave real answers, and somewhere in the middle of it the ambassador and subject dynamic collapsed naturally into something more like two people who both took magic seriously having a genuine conversation about it. She knew things he didn't, the castle's specific magical history, the theory behind certain advanced transfiguration applications, the history of the sorting system. He knew things she found visibly surprising, his ward theory framework, his creature communication protocols, the combat magic structure he and Miriam had been developing. When she stood to leave, at the door, she stopped and looked at him one more time. "I owe you something," she said. "You don't," Harry said. "I do." The correct response isn't arguable. She looked at him steadily. "I will not be used against you. Whatever Dumbledore asks of me in terms of managing or monitoring or redirecting you, I want you to know that I will do my job as a professor and head of house. That job does not include managing you on his behalf." Harry held her eyes. "Thank you," he said. "That means a great deal." She nodded once, crisp, and walked back down the path toward the lock with her precise stride. Harry stood in the doorway and watched her go. Miriam appeared from the direction of the lock 30 seconds later, visibly not coming from where she'd been listening. "Well," she said. "She's not going to be a problem," Harry said. "I could have told you that. You did tell me that. I wanted to know for myself." He turned back inside. Dumbledore's third move will be something more formal. Probably an official request through the ministry citing his executor status. Ragnarok will handle it. Yes. What's the fourth move? Miriam was quiet for a moment. He'll make sure you're sorted into Gryffindor. Harry looked at her. He can't instruct the Hat. No. But he can make sure everyone you meet before the sorting, students, ghosts, castle staff, is positioned to influence your perception of the houses. Soft framing. Creating an environment where Gryffindor feels natural and right before you even sit down. She met his eyes. He needs you in Gryffindor for the hero narrative to work. His story of the chosen Gryffindor who saves the world with the aid of his beloved mentor requires you to be in Gryffindor. What do you think the Hat will say? Harry asked. She almost smiled. I think the Hat is 900 years old and has no particular interest in anyone's narrative. She sat down. I think the Hat will say whatever is true. Ragnarok's response to Dumbledore's third move, the formal Wisengamot petition citing executor status and requesting a formal assessment of Harry's educational arrangement, was filed within 48 hours of the petition and was, by all accounts, beautiful in its systematic comprehensiveness. It cited the independent trustee status established in 1989. It cited the Gringotts Ministry Accord. It cited Harry's documented educational achievements, provided in an academic summary prepared by Miriam with the signatures of 3 external magical scholars who had reviewed it and described it as exceptional. It cited the Coalition's Protected Location Agreement, supported by creature rights documentation going back to 1984. And then, most precisely, it cited a clause in the 1983 inheritance law modifications, specifically, the clause that Ragnarok had spent 4 years waiting to use, that prohibited any executor from petitioning for oversight of an 11-year-old child who had demonstrated sufficient magical and personal competency to manage their own affairs, where that competency had been assessed by a Gringotts-certified evaluator. Ragnarok had certified Harry himself, 3 months earlier, in a document that was now filed at Gringotts, the ministry, and 3 copies held by coalition members. The Wisengamot reviewed the petition for 6 days and dismissed it. Harry heard about this from Ragnarok on the Wednesday before the September 1st departure and felt something settle in his chest, not triumph, nothing as simple as that, but the deep functional satisfaction of a plan that has been worked patiently toward for years arriving at its intended point. 3 years of legal architecture, he said. 4.5, Ragnarok corrected. I started in 1987. You were just 6. A pause. The work was worth doing regardless of outcome. But yes. It arrived. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it with the full weight of what it was. Don't thank me, Ragnarok said. Goblins don't thank and we don't receive thanks. We observe agreements. He looked at the fireplace flames for a moment. But I will say this. James Potter paid for those 1979 Wardstones and asked for our institutional care for his family's interests. We are obligated by that agreement to provide it. The fact that it has also been, a pause, satisfying work, is incidental. Of course, Harry said. The ghost of something moved in Ragnarok's expression. Good luck, Mr. Potter. Thank you, Mr. Ragnarok. September 1st. King's Cross was louder than London had been, the Muggle and magical worlds overlapping in the peculiar way they overlapped at the barrier, normal families with trolleys and children, and then through the barrier an entirely different flavor of organized chaos. Harry came through the barrier at 9:45, a quarter hour before Miriam had suggested, because he wanted the time to read the platform before it was at full capacity. He stood in the steam and the crowd with his trunk on a trolley and Sable's absence a specific wait because she couldn't come to Hogwarts, not in the way he was used to her, she'd be in the forest, the Forbidden Forest, which was something, but it was the first time in 5 years he'd be beyond daily reach. He'd felt this leaving the cottage that morning, the first pang of genuine loss since the cupboard, and had sat with it honestly rather than pushing it away. Rook had been waiting at the path's end below the cottage. He'd walked down to meet Harry in the morning mist and they'd stood together looking at the lock for a moment. I'll feel you in the castle, Harry said. The forest is, adjacent, Rook said. The forest runs to the castle's edge. The ley lines are connected. I'll know where you are. Harry looked at him. The morning mist. The lock. All of it. I've never been away from here. I know. I'll be fine, Harry said, which was true and also a slightly different thing from what he was feeling. Yes, Rook said. You will. He put a hand, briefly, heavily, with the weight of oak and patience, on Harry's shoulder. The stars have been clear about September for 8 months. They're the clearest they've been in years. What do they say? Rook looked at the sky, at the early morning paleness of it. That everything that has been growing reaches the next stage, he said. That it reaches it fully and in its own way. He removed his hand. Go. Don't look back at the lock or you'll stand there until October. Harry had gone. He'd looked back once, at the ridge, at the cottage below and the lock and the rowan tree with its bowtruckles, and then he turned and kept walking. Now on platform 9 3/4 he stood in the steam and felt the network from this distance, reduced in detail, still present, Rook's amber glow a background warmth in the southeast direction, Miriam's sharp complex signature beside him, the lock's kelpie signature barely perceptible but there. Miriam was beside him on the platform. She had come to London to see him off, which she'd announced 2 days ago with the same casual directness she announced everything significant, as if it hadn't taken some internal effort to decide. She was looking at the train with her canvas jacket and her assessing eyes. Don't let any teacher bore you into switching off, she said. I won't. If the defense against the dark arts teacher doesn't know what they're doing, you don't have to pretend they do. I know. Right. Not just to Rook. To me. Every week, Harry said. She looked at him. The professional distance was not in evidence this morning. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that evening he'd said this is mine, the way that meant the thing that lived under the carefully maintained separateness. You are extraordinary, she said, plainly. Not because of the magic. The magic is extraordinary too, but that's not what I mean. You are extraordinary in the way that matters, the way you're present with things, the way you listen, the way you don't give up on people who deserve giving up on and don't close off on them either. She stopped. Straightened. Don't you dare lose that in there. I won't, he said. And then, because it was true and because she deserved to hear it, you built most of it. You and Rook and all of them. You built it. She looked away. At the train. You grew it, she said. We just gave it the right soil. He hugged her then, which surprised them both, He wasn't generally impulsive about physical things and neither was she, but it felt correct and she returned it fully, briefly, and then stepped back with her chin up and her eyes doing something complicated. "Go on," she said. He went. He found a compartment at the train's rear and sat alone for about 3 minutes before the door opened and a girl with alarming amounts of bushy hair and a book under each arm looked in and said, with the directness of someone who had decided not to waste time, "Most of the compartments are full already. Can I sit here?" "Yes," Harry said. She sat down, opened one of the books, read approximately 2 sentences, then closed it and looked at him. "You're Harry Potter." "Yes," he said. "I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about you. Not just the books people have written about the night you survived, those are mostly unreliable, I've cross-referenced them, but the historical context, the Potter family magical lineage, the documented significance of the event." She said this at speed, with the quality of someone who had been wanting to say it and was getting it done efficiently. "I think most accounts of what happened in Godric's Hollow are functionally mythologized and the actual magical mechanics are far more interesting than the story people have built around them." Harry looked at her. She looked back at him without the awe that most people managed when they said his name. She had the look of someone who was interested in the facts. "I think you're right," he said. "The actual magical mechanics are much more interesting." She blinked. "You know about them?" "Some. I've been studying related theory for 3 years. There are still things that don't add up." She reached into her bag and pulled out one of her books, thick, annotated in the margins already, the cover showing it was a 6th-year level magical theory text. She opened to a bookmarked page. "This is what I think doesn't add up. Tell me if I'm wrong." He looked at the page. He wasn't wrong. They talked for 4 hours. By the time the trolley came around he'd learned that she was Muggleborn, that she'd received her Hogwarts letter with the specific joy of someone who had been trying to explain themselves for 11 years and had finally found the explanation, that she'd read the entire Hogwarts library catalogue and memorized the core curriculum for all 7 years before she boarded this train. She learned that he'd been educated privately in Scotland, that he had working knowledge of 6 magical traditions including 2 non-European ones, and that he found the standard British curriculum frustratingly narrow in its coverage of non-human magical theory. She found this immediately and strongly interesting. He found her immediately and strongly interesting for reasons that were different from the reasons most people found him interesting, which were the wrong reasons. The compartment door opened a second time, 2 hours in, for Ronald Weasley, who was ginger and earnest and had food on his chin and opened with, "Is it true you can speak to magical creatures?" "My dad mentioned it and he was trying not to seem excited but he was obviously very excited." He looked at Harry with the open warm curiosity of someone who hadn't prescripted this interaction. "I'm Ron Weasley." "Harry Potter," Harry said. "And yes, it's true." Ron's face did something completely unguarded and delighted. "That is so brilliant," he said, and meant it with no additional agenda, and sat down. The 3 of them ate sweets from the trolley and by the time the train reached Hogsmeade, something had been established that had nothing to do with house placement or prophecy or Dumbledore's plans for any of them. Just 3 11-year-olds in a compartment with good questions and enough room for each other's enthusiasms. The Great Hall did the thing to Harry that it did to everyone, the candles, the ceiling, the sheer volume of magic in one space, but he also felt, beneath all of that, the castle itself. Rook had been right. The castle recognized him. Not the way a person recognizes a person, not with warmth or assessment, but in the way that old stone recognizes something that has been in its presence before, a deep vibration in the walls, a quality of attention from the architecture, ancient and patient and completely certain of what it was looking at. He stood in the line of first years and felt the castle's attention and felt it the way he felt everything, as information, as a relationship, as this and I are in the same world and the world is therefore different. He looked at the staff table once. Dumbledore was at the center of it, gold robes, half-moon spectacles, the magnificent beard. He was looking at the first years with an expression of benevolent interest, and when his gaze reached Harry it paused, and something moved in his blue eyes, rapid assessment, quickly controlled, and then he smiled, warm and grandfatherly, the smile of a man who was very good at smiling. Harry looked at him steadily for 3 seconds and then looked away. The sorting began. Names called, students mounted the stool, the hat placed and considered and announced. Harry watched the hat with interest. It was exactly as Rook had described, ancient and opinionated, and when it spoke on each student there was the quality of something that had actually considered and actually decided rather than something going through a routine. Potter, Harry. He walked to the stool. He sat. The hat came down over his eyes and the world went dark and private. The hat said nothing for a long moment. Then it said, inside his head, in a voice that was old and layered and completely unhurried, "Oh." Harry waited. "You're different," the hat said. Not surprised. More like something confirming what it had been told. 900 years I've been sorting students. I know what a sorted student feels like before I've touched them. Gryffindor courage, Ravenclaw hunger, Hufflepuff warmth, Slytherin will. They come in already inclined. Already leaning toward the thing they are. A pause. You don't lean. No, Harry agreed. You have all four. Genuinely. Not traces, not inclinations. Full and developed. The hat was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore is going to be very put out by whatever I say next. And there was something in the hat's voice that was, distinctly, amused. I know, Harry said. Where do I belong? Where do you think you belong? Harry considered. He thought about the Parliament in the Forbidden Forest. He thought about Ragnar's stone chamber and Rook's star maps and Miriam in her canvas jacket and the Highland Loch and the dragons on the mountain. He thought about what all of it had in common. Not to any one thing, he said. All of it together. Yes, the hat said. That's exactly right. But we only have 4 options and I have to pick one. Then pick the one where I can do the most good, Harry said. The hat was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then it said, Gryffindor. The table erupted. Harry took the hat off and looked at it for a moment, and the hat, if a hat could, looked back with a quality of private amusement that was entirely its own. He put it back on its stool and walked to the Gryffindor table. He sat. Hermione sat down beside him 15 seconds later with a relieved expression that suggested she'd been moderately worried about Ravenclaw. Ron arrived too after her, already reaching for the food before he'd properly seated himself. Harry felt the castle vibrate beneath him, pleased, patient, recognizing. He looked at the staff table. McGonagall was watching him with the expression she'd had in the cottage, held, complex, privately something. She met his eyes for a moment and then looked deliberately away. Dumbledore was watching him too. His expression was warm and pleased and his eyes were very careful. He raised his goblet slightly in something that was almost a toast. Harry looked back. He didn't raise his goblet. He simply looked, calm and direct and without performance, for long enough that it was entirely clear he was making a choice rather than being unable to look away. Then he turned to Ron, who was explaining something about wizard chess with great enthusiasm and food in his mouth, and he let the great hall noise wash over him and settle. The castle hummed under his hands where they rested on the Gryffindor table. Old stone. Old magic. Old enough to know what mattered. He was here. Chapter 6, The World That Answers. The first week of Hogwarts established several things quickly. The first was that Harry Potter did not behave like someone who needed Hogwarts. He was not awed by the moving staircases or confused by the ghosts or overwhelmed by the class material in the way that first years were supposed to be overwhelmed. He moved through the castle with the attention of someone reading a new landscape rather than someone being managed by one, and the castle responded to him in small ways that the other students didn't notice and the staff absolutely did. Torches that burned slightly brighter when he passed. Doors opening a half-second before he reached them. The way the great stone walls seemed to lean, infinitesimally, toward his presence. The second was that he was not performing normalcy. He didn't shrink his vocabulary around other students. He didn't pretend not to know things. When Professor Flitwick asked a question about Charm's theory that no first year was expected to answer and Harry answered it, correctly, with the additional context of how the theory applied in non-wand traditions, Flitwick's expression went through delight to professional excitement to something almost reverent in about 4 seconds. The third was that Dumbledore had been very busy before September 1st. Harry identified the environmental framing Miriam had predicted within 24 hours of arrival. The ghost, nearly headless Nick, who introduced himself specifically to Harry with warm enthusiasm about Gryffindor's noble history. The way the common room seemed arranged so that Harry's natural sightlines met Gryffindor regalia. The older students who were somehow always available to tell him about Gryffindor's tradition, its importance, its particular character. Small things, none conclusive, all consistent in direction. He let all of it wash over him without remark. Not because he was ignoring it. Because he was cataloging it, and because engaging with it would give it weight it didn't deserve, and because there were more interesting things to be doing. Hermione noticed on Wednesday. She came to the library table he was working at in a free period and sat across from him and said, without looking up from her own work, "Has anyone else found it strange that the guidance we've been receiving since Monday is almost exclusively Gryffindor positive?" "Yes," Harry said. "You've been noticing." "Since Sunday night." She looked up from her book. "Who's doing it?" "Someone who had a lot of time to set it up before we arrived and who has strong opinions about what Gryffindor represents symbolically." He turned a page. "Don't worry about it. It doesn't work on us because we know it's happening. That's the whole defense against soft framing, awareness." Hermione looked at him with the expression she had when she was filing new information under things I need to think about more fully. "That's remarkably unsurprised for someone who just arrived." "I was briefed," Harry said simply, and went back to his reading. Ron arrived at the table carrying 3 books under each arm and dropped them with a crash that made the librarian look up sharply from 3 aisles away. He sat down. "Weasley family meeting in the common room tonight," he said, "which means Percy is going to spend an hour telling me everything he already told me on the train about OWL. Preparation, but the good news is Fred and George are around this weekend and they always know where the good food is." He looked at Harry. "You should come. Mom keeps writing asking about you and Fred said if I didn't introduce them he was going to arrange it himself, which I can't allow because Fred's arrangements are always," he searched for the word, "ambitious." "I'd like that," Harry said, meaning it. He'd been thinking about the Weasleys in the context of Dumbledore's attempted approach, but Ron's warmth was so completely itself, so entirely without agenda, that the context kept falling away when he was actually around him. He reminded Harry, in some specific way, of Hagrid. The same quality of occupying space with uncomplicated goodwill. "Brilliant," Ron said, and began excavating his bag for a quill. Defense against the dark arts was taught by Professor Quirrell, and Harry knew within the first 20 minutes. It wasn't the stammer, which was performed with the over-calibrated consistency of someone who had rehearsed it enough to believe it themselves. It wasn't the nervous disposition, though that too was a costume. What Harry knew it from was the signature, the dark layered quality of the magical presence Quirrell carried, the particular cold at the back of his neck that he'd felt in the Wardstone readings Ragnarok had shown him, the readings associated with Voldemort's strengthening return. The sensation of something that was 2 things pretending to be one. He said nothing in class. He sat at the back with Hermione and took notes and let nothing show on his face. After class, walking across the courtyard in a pale September afternoon, he sent a focused pulse southward toward the forest perimeter, not the wide broadcast, the specific directional scent he'd developed for long-distance coalition contact, and felt Rook's amber glow sharpen immediately in response. "I know," it said, without words. "Seen. Noted. Hold." He held. He wrote to Miriam that evening instead of waiting for the weekly letter. He kept it to 3 lines, in the notation system they developed for anything sensitive. Data teacher is compromised. Dark signature present. Second presence, cold, familiar frequency. Advising. Her response came the next morning with a swiftness that suggested she hadn't slept much. 7 lines. Ragnarok alerted. Rook cross-referencing. Do not engage. Do not reveal awareness. Monitor only. Trust the process. Trust yourself. He trusted the process. He went to defense against the dark arts twice a week and was a perfectly adequate student, attentive, correct in his answers, unremarkable in his performance. Quirrell looked at him sometimes with an attention that was not the professor looking at student attention, and Harry felt it and filed it and showed nothing. He told Ron and Hermione on a Saturday morning in the library, 2 weeks in. Hermione's response was methodical and immediate. She cross-referenced every piece of information she had about possession and dark artifacts and the mechanics of Voldemort's survival and had 3 pages of notes within the hour. Ron went pale and then angry and then very focused in the way that Harry was learning meant Ron had decided something and was done deliberating. Right, he said. What do we do? Nothing yet, Harry said. Wait and watch. Rook's working something. Ragnarok's working something. When it's time to act we'll know because things will start moving faster. How will we know it's moving faster? Hermione asked. It'll feel different, Harry said. Like a change in air pressure before a storm. You'll know. She looked at him with the specific look she had when a piece of information came from a framework she didn't yet have full access to. How do you know what that feels like? I've been reading weather for 3 years, he said. October arrived and Hogwarts became its October self, mists in the morning, the grounds going amber, the lake carrying the low-light quality of a pewter mirror. Harry had settled into the castle's rhythms the way he settled into every new environment, by listening until it made sense, and then by becoming part of how it worked rather than separate from it. He was, by mid-October, on speaking terms with every ghost in the building. Not socially, not oh hello how are you terms, but the kind of terms where information moved. The Grey Lady knew things about the castle's magical architecture that weren't in any book because she'd been there when it was built. The Bloody Baron had opinions about the ley line distribution that were practically centaur in their precision, which made sense given his age. Peeves was Peeves, chaotic, anarchic, and startlingly useful when he decided to be, which he decided to be twice in October for reasons Harry suspected were related to a conversation they'd had in a corridor where Harry had been the only person in Hogwarts history to listen to Peeves' complaints about the poltergeist's living conditions without interrupting. He was performing adequately in every class and exceptionally in most of them, which was a balance that Miriam had specifically recommended. Don't hide but don't perform. Do the work at the level the work deserves. That's different from showing off and different from diminishing yourself. He did the work at the level the work deserved. The result was that his professors had individual and collectively very different responses to him. Flitwick was delighted. McGonagall was professionally excellent in a way that had warmth underneath it. Snape was a problem. Professor Snape was, Harry concluded after 3 weeks, a genuinely brilliant man who had made several consequential choices in his past and was now living in a permanent state of owing Dumbledore his continued existence, and the combination had produced someone who performed cruelty as control because control was all he had left. He had also loved Harry's mother, which Harry had learned from Hagrid's letters before school started, and this had organized itself in Snape into something neither grief nor love but a complicated bitterness that he pointed at Harry's face every time he walked into potions. Harry was not afraid of Snape. He was also not cruel to Snape, which was more unusual. He sat at the front of potions, not where Snape assigned him to sit, in the back where he could be managed by distance, but where the best light came through for reading the ingredient properties, and he answered questions correctly and quickly and without editorializing, and when Snape attempted to use the class atmosphere to belittle him, Harry would look at him steadily and say whatever the correct answer was and leave Snape nowhere to go. In the 4th week, after a potions class where Snape had been particularly aggressive and Harry had been particularly unimpressed and the class had been very quiet watching them, Snape stayed him at the door. The rest of the students filed out. Harry waited. Snape looked at him with those black eyes that were very intelligent and very defended. "You're not what I expected," he said, which was the most honest thing Harry had heard from him. I know, Harry said. I'm not what anyone expected. That's not an accident. A pause. Your father was a different person than I am, Harry said. I know who he was. I also know he was 17 when you knew him, which is probably the least accurate version of a person that exists. He met Snape's eyes. I'm not him. I'm not interested in whatever argument you had with him. I'm interested in potions, which you teach very well when you're not doing the other thing. The silence was extremely loud. The other thing, Snape repeated. The thing where you try to manage the room by making me small, Harry said. It doesn't work because I'm not afraid of you. But it wastes time that could be used for actual potions, which I'd prefer. Snape stared at him. I'm not trying to be difficult, Harry said. I'm trying to be honest, because I think you respond better to honesty than to performance even though you've arranged things so that most people give you performance. He held the potions master's gaze. Can we agree that potions is what happens in that room? Snape said nothing for a very long time. His expression was unreadable in the way of something very controlled. Then he said, 10 points to Gryffindor, which was so unexpected that Harry almost blinked. For correct application of the base inhibitor in today's practical. He turned back to his desk. Dismissed. Harry left. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the way he felt after any exchange that went toward honesty, like something complicated had been acknowledged and could now, possibly, be worked with. The potions classroom dynamic shifted after that, not dramatically, not into anything warm, but into something functional and occasionally, in its severe way, mutual. November brought the troll. Harry knew about the troll before anyone else did. He felt it the moment it entered the castle's lower corridors, its vast dim magical signature stomping through the castle's sensory field like someone walking through a photograph. He was in the great hall at the Halloween feast when he felt it, and he stood up before Professor Quirrell ran in to announce it, which McGonagall noticed and which she filed away with the expression of a woman whose files were getting very full. The rest of the feast descended into chaos. Students directed to their dormitories. Prefects hurting people. Harry went the other direction. Not because he was brave in the look-at-me sense. Because Hermione was in the bathroom on the 3rd floor and he'd realized she'd been there before the feast because she'd been crying. Ron had said something obtuse and unkind about her showing off and she'd left and nobody had noticed she was missing yet. He'd been meaning to tell someone and now there wasn't time for the telling. He went because she was in the wrong place and the troll was moving toward it and those two facts together required a response. Ron was beside him on the stairs before he'd reached the first landing, breathing fast, no explanation offered. Harry didn't ask for one. They moved. They found the troll in the girls' bathroom corridor and found it before it found the bathroom itself, which was the narrow margin. It turned to look at them and Harry felt its signature up close, enormous, blunt, not malicious, just hungry and confused and 12 feet of muscle in an enclosed space. He understood hunger and confusion. He reached out with the creature communication frequency, the one he'd been using since he was 5, and pushed toward it. The troll registered it the way very simple creatures registered it, not with language, not with thought, with sensation. The sensation Harry sent was, stop. Here. Turn. The troll stopped. Hermione appeared at the bathroom door, saw the troll, pressed herself against the wall. Ron's wand was up, the Wingardium Leviosa forming already. Good instinct, Harry noted, the right application for something this size. He didn't redirect Ron. He let the spell go, the troll's club rising, the troll looking up at it with bovine confusion, and Harry kept the steady communication pressure up, stay. Here. Look at the thing. The club came down on the troll's own head. The troll sat down heavily enough to crack the flagstones. McGonagall arrived 30 seconds later with Snape and Quirrell. She looked at the troll, at the cracked flagstones, at the 3 first-years standing in the corridor. Her gaze stopped on Harry. He felt her reading it, the stillness of him, the way he was facing the troll rather than having backed away from it, the quality of attention in his expression that was not shock. She looked at him for a long moment. "Explain," she said. "Hermione was here before the feast and nobody noticed when they cleared the hall," Harry said. "We came to get her." Weasley's levitation spell was the appropriate response. McGonagall looked at Hermione, who opened her mouth. "That's what happened," Hermione said, which was as close to lying as she apparently came, and which she said with the conviction of someone who had decided this was the version and was committing. McGonagall gave each of them 5 points. She looked at Harry one more time on the way out, the "I know this is not the whole story" look, and left. Quirrell left too. Snape had been watching Harry throughout with the intensity of someone reassessing a calculation. He left without speaking. In the corridor, with the unconscious troll between them and the castle settling back to its Halloween quiet, Hermione looked at Harry and said, "You did something to it." "I asked it to stop." "You asked it. It worked, didn't it?" She looked at the troll. She looked at Harry. "Teach me that," she said. "It takes time," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." Ron was looking between them. "You can teach that?" "The theory. The practice takes a particular kind of attention that I can help you develop but can't give you. It's something you build." Harry looked at them both, Ron's warm open face, Hermione's sharp interested one. "It's not a spell. It's more like, learning to listen in a different direction." "I can learn that," Hermione said immediately. "Yeah," Ron said. "Me too." A pause. "What do we do about Quirrell?" They looked at each other in the corridor with the troll snoring between them. "We wait," Harry said. "And we keep building." December moved through Hogwarts with the particular quality of an old magical building in winter, everything deeper, more concentrated, the magic of the place condensed by the cold into something almost visible. Harry had stopped finding the castle beautiful in the initial impression way and started finding it beautiful in the way you find something beautiful when you actually know it, specifically, accurately, in all its complexity. He knew the castle's moods now. The way the third-floor corridor felt different on rainy days, a vibration in the stones there that had nothing to do with the locked door at its end, which he'd identified within his first week as a secondary ward system over something significant. He knew the corridor near the library where a ley line ran unusually close to the surface and made certain spells behave differently. He knew which paintings watched which corridors and reported to whom, more reporting systems in Hogwarts than most people appreciated, most of them ultimately cycling back to Dumbledore. He had been very careful about those. Not avoiding them. Just aware. On a Thursday in December, Dumbledore summoned him. The note came through McGonagall, formally, requesting his presence at the headmaster's office after dinner. She handed it to him with the careful neutrality she used when she was not going to editorialize but wanted him to know she was available if he needed anything. He thanked her and pocketed the note. He told Hermione and Ron at dinner. "Tonight?" Ron said. "Do you want us to?" "No," Harry said. "It's fine. I've been waiting for this since September." Hermione was looking at her food. "What do you think he'll do?" "Talk," Harry said. "He's very good at talking. He'll be warm and interested and he'll try to build something between us that I'm grateful for, because gratitude is what he uses." He looked at his dinner. "I'll be polite. I'll be honest. I won't be managed. What if he asks about the network? About the people who, I'll tell him I'm well supported and leave the details where they are." He ate. "He already knows roughly what I have." McGonagall told him accurately. "The mystery isn't who, it's how much. I'm not showing him how much." Ron was quiet for a moment. "He's still the headmaster," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't disagreement, just acknowledgement. "He runs the school." "He runs the school," Harry agreed. "I live here now. Those are related things and they're not the same thing." He looked at Ron steadily. "I'm not going to fight him. I'm not going to disrespect him. I'm going to be exactly what I am, which is someone who doesn't need him, and I'm going to let him figure out what to do with that. Ron thought about this. That's going to drive him mad, he said. Probably, Harry said. Yes. The gargoyle and the moving staircase and the office at the top, and Harry stood in the doorway for a moment and read it the way he read all new spaces, the accumulated magic, the objects spinning their small calculations, the pensieve in its cabinet, the portraits of old headmasters awake and watching. Fawkes was on his perch. The phoenix looked at Harry with eyes that were fire-colored and very old and very sure, and made a sound, one note, brief, that vibrated in Harry's chest like something recognized. Harry looked at Fawkes. He sent a small warm pulse in the phoenix's direction, just presence, just I see you, and Fawkes's eyes brightened and he ruffled his feathers once with a sound like burning paper. Harry. Dumbledore was at his desk. He stood when Harry came in, which was a deliberate graciousness, a signal of respect that was also a performance of respect. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please. Sit. Harry sat. He looked at Dumbledore directly. Dumbledore sat too. He looked at Harry with those blue eyes that were extraordinarily expressive, warm, interested, assessing, and behind all of it, very precisely, the intelligence of a man who had not been surprised in a long time and was finding the experience of being surprised unexpectedly clarifying. I have been looking forward to this conversation for some time, Dumbledore said. I know, Harry said. A pause. I imagine you do. He folded his hands on the desk. I want to apologize to you. Harry waited. I made a decision in 1981 that I believed was the best available option under circumstances of extraordinary difficulty. I had constraints, magical, practical, political, and I worked within them to the best of my ability. I believed the blood protection at your aunt's home was the safest environment I could provide. He held Harry's eyes. I was not adequately attentive to what that environment would mean for your daily life. I should have been. The oversight was mine and I regret it. It was a good apology. It was genuine in its way, Harry could feel that, the creature frequency reading of sincerity underneath the performance of it. He could also feel the part underneath the sincerity, the calculation, the assessment, the let's see how he receives this. Both things were there. Both things were real. Thank you, Harry said. I accept the apology. Dumbledore looked at him. It doesn't change what happened, Harry continued. But I don't need it to. I'm not holding it against you, not because it wasn't serious, but because holding it doesn't give me anything useful. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I want to be clear about something. I'm not angry at you. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here because Hogwarts is the right place for me to be educated and because this is your school and you asked to see me. He paused. What I'm not is the child you planned for. The silence was very precise. No, Dumbledore said quietly. You're not. I have people who care for me and have cared for me for 7 years. I have an education that has been thorough and unusual. I have legal standing over my own affairs. I have, he thought about what word to use, a community that will continue to exist regardless of what happens at Hogwarts. He met the blue eyes. I'm telling you this not as a threat. As information. Because you should know what you're working with, and because I think you're intelligent enough to recognize that trying to work against what I have would be significantly more costly than working alongside it. Dumbledore was very still. He was, Harry recognized, genuinely thinking, not performing thought, actually doing it, recalculating with the new information the way someone does when they've been given a variable they hadn't modeled. This was the moment Miriam had told him to watch for, when Dumbledore stopped the prepared version and started the actual version. The creature network, Dumbledore said. Among others, Harry said. Ragnarok. A pause. The centaurs. Another pause. Miriam Ashgrove. The name landed differently than the others, something personal in it, something that had history. She was a student here. A remarkable one. I made errors with her as well. Yes, Harry said. You did. Is she well? The question was genuine. Harry felt that clearly. He also felt the complexity underneath it, regret, something that might once have been mentorship, the particular weight of a mistake made with someone talented. She's very well, he said. She's extraordinary. She taught me more in 5 years than I could have learned in a decade anywhere else. Dumbledore looked at his folded hands for a moment. When he looked back up, his expression had changed, shifted off the warm grandfatherly register into something quieter and more real. What do you want from Hogwarts? He asked. Actually. Not what you're prepared to say. What do you want? Harry looked at him for a moment, reading the question for agenda and finding it, this time, mostly clean. The education, he said. Real education. The castle. Peers who challenge me, I've found 2 already who do that, and we're 2 months in. The experience of being in a space where magic has been practiced at that depth for that long. He paused. And eventually I want Hogwarts to be different. Not by conflict. By accumulation. The creature rights content in the curriculum is embarrassingly inadequate. The non-European magical traditions are almost invisible. The way magical creatures are talked about in most of these classrooms, he stopped himself. That's not tonight's conversation. It could be, Dumbledore said. Not yet, Harry said. We need to be something other than strangers first. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time with those blue eyes. Then he said something that Harry hadn't expected. You're right. Just that. You're right. Not a concession calculated to win trust. Just a man confronting the accuracy of a statement and finding himself without an argument against it. Fawkes made another sound from his perch. It carried, somehow, approval. There is a matter, Dumbledore said carefully, that I believe you've already identified. He looked at Harry. The 3rd-floor corridor. The Philosopher's Stone, Harry said. Dumbledore's hand stilled on his desk. Nicholas Flamel. The moving staircase trap sequence. Harry met his eyes. I've known since mid-October. The ward signatures are legible if you know what you're reading. He paused. Quirrell is a more immediate concern. Yes, Dumbledore said, and something very sharp lived under the quiet of it. He is. You know. I have known for some time. I have been, a pause, allowing the situation to develop, in the hope of gathering more intelligence about Voldemort's methods and allies. Harry looked at him. You've been using Quirrell as bait, he said. And the stone as the lure. The old man didn't flinch. I had hoped to control the approach more precisely than the situation has allowed. There are complications I hadn't fully anticipated. He looked at Harry with an expression that was many things at once and was, underneath all of them, someone asking for something he wasn't sure he had the right to ask for. You're more prepared than I expected. More protected. More, you don't need to manage this alone, Harry said. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just directly. That's what I'm saying. Not that I'm in charge. Not that you should hand me the situation. Just that you don't have to manage every piece of it yourself, which is what you always try to do. He looked at the spinning instruments. It's lonely, doing it that way. And it produces errors. The longest silence yet. I've been told that before, Dumbledore said quietly. I've been very bad at hearing it. I know, Harry said. He stood to go. At the door he stopped, because something needed to be said that was neither strategy nor concession but simply true. He looked back. My parents, he said. James and Lily. Whatever you feel about how things have gone, I know you cared about them. Hagrid told me. The way you talk about them in public, the way the wizarding world still speaks their names, that's real, what you gave them. The grief. The tribute. He met Dumbledore's eyes. "I don't want to take that away from you. I'm not here to destroy your legacy. I'm here to be myself." He paused. "Those don't have to be the same conflict." He left. Walking back down the moving staircase, in the cold December corridor, he felt the castle breathe around him, the old stone, the long magic, the deep patience of a place that had seen everything and remembered all of it. He put his hand flat on the wall as he walked and felt it press back. "Well done," the castle said, in the only language it had, which was sensation and warmth and the specific quality of very old approval. He went to find Hermione and Ron. January was 3 weeks old when the dark signature intensified. Harry felt it on a Wednesday morning at breakfast, the cold frequency spiking sharply, the Quirrell signature moving with unusual agitation, the specific quality of something building toward action. He set down his toast and sent the directional pulse south toward the forest and felt Rook's amber glow snap immediately into active alertness. He looked at Hermione across the table. She looked at him. "Today," she said. "Tonight," he said. He's building toward something. Waiting for the right moment in the castle's night cycle. He picked up his toast again. "We have until after midnight." "We should tell Dumbledore," she said. "I already sent a note this morning. Before breakfast. He ate. He'll respond or he won't. Either way we should be ready." Ron looked between them. "Ready how?" Harry thought about the third-floor corridor. He'd been through the ward sequence 3 times in his mind, each time more carefully, mapping the trap system that had been built around the stone. Good work, genuinely creative, the protection sequence reflecting the professor's individual magical signatures. Challenging for an adult, not insurmountable. For someone with 7 years of advanced ward theory and no particular anxiety about magical traps, navigable. But that wasn't the point. The point was what waited at the end, which was neither a stone nor a trap but something that had been building to this moment since before Harry was born. "We eat breakfast," Harry said. "We go to class. We do everything normally. And tonight we're ready." He sent a second pulse toward the forest, not just to Rook, the wide broadcast, the one he'd been doing since he was 4 but now intentional and aimed, the signal sent not from fear but from purpose. "Coalition. Tonight. I may need the world to answer." The world answered from every direction simultaneously. Rook's amber certainty. Ragnarok's precise wardstone signature pulsing in recognition. Miriam's sharp and complex magic, 100 miles north but suddenly very present, as if she'd been waiting. The castle's deep vibration beneath his feet. And further, wider, the creatures in the forest, the mere people under the lake, the centaur herd, the Thestrals everywhere. All of it warm and immediate and completely certain. "We hear you. We are here." He breathed out slowly. Ron was watching him with the particular expression he had when Harry did the thing that was hard to describe, the not quite visible thing, the reaching outward thing. "You're talking to them right now, aren't you?" Ron said. "Listening," Harry said. "Mostly listening." "What are they saying?" Harry thought about how to translate it. "That we're not alone," he said. "That we never have been. They went at midnight." Not because Harry had a plan that required midnight specifically. Because the dark signature had spiked at 11:40 in a way that said now without language, and waiting would mean arriving after rather than during, and during was the only point where anything could be changed. The trap sequence in the third-floor corridor, the Devil's Snare, which Harry walked through without concern because Devil's Snare responds to stillness and warmth and he was absolutely still and the warmth he radiated was the warmth of something the plant found non-threatening. The winged keys, which he caught and identified with the speed of someone who'd been reading magical creature behavior for 6 years, McGonagall's chess set, which Ron played and played brilliantly, with the focused, strategic certainty of someone who had been playing chess since he could sit upright, and Harry watched and felt the chess pieces' small individual magical signatures and did not interfere with Ron's game because Ron's game didn't need interference. Snape's logic puzzle, which Hermione solved in 4 minutes and which had a satisfaction to it that was clearly personal. Harry went through each of them at the pace they required, not faster, not performing urgency. There was something beyond the traps. He knew what it was. He had known what it was since October. The mirror of Eriste was in the final chamber, and in front of it stood Quirrell. Or what was wearing Quirrell? The stammer was gone. The nervous disposition was gone. What stood in front of the mirror was the Quirrell shape, but the signature was fully out now, cold, layered, the particular frequency Harry had been reading in Ragnarok's Wardstone data for 3 years, the signature of something that had survived death by refusing to agree that death applied to it. Quirrell turned. His eyes were wrong. Wrong color, wrong quality, focused with an intelligence and intensity that belonged to something else entirely using borrowed apparatus. He looked at Harry with those wrong eyes and said nothing for a moment, which was itself a kind of assessment. "Harry Potter," he said, and his voice was Quirrell's but the cadence was not. "Smaller than I expected." "People keep saying that," Harry said. The wrong eyes narrowed. "You came alone." "No," Harry said. "I didn't." Quirrell, Voldemort, looked at the chamber. The 2 children behind Harry, Hermione and Ron at the chamber entrance. Nothing else visible. "Your school friends," he said, dismissing them. "That's not what I mean." He looked at Harry with those cold focused eyes. "I mean the other things. I've been feeling them since you entered the school. The network. The signatures. A pause, the quality of genuine consideration, the world that moves around you." "Yes," Harry said. "Impressive for a child. Thank you. It won't help you." He said it with absolute certainty, the certainty of someone who had been operating on a particular understanding of power for 50 years and saw no reason to revise it. Power is control. Domination. What you've built is, he gestured, the gesture Quirrell's hands made, but the contempt behind it was something older, cooperative. Relational. It depends on others choosing to act. That is weakness structured as strength. Harry looked at him. "Is it? I have never needed anyone's choice. I take what I need. I always have." The cold eyes. "I survived death. I survived it because I am stronger than it. Not because anything chose to save me." He stepped toward Harry. "Give me the stone." "No," Harry said. The first spell came fast, the kind of fast that decades of dark mastery produced, a killing curse reflex, and Harry's shield was up before the words finished, the commanded structure-relational response hybrid that he and Miriam had developed in the Highland Meadow, and it didn't just block the curse, it read it and reshaped itself around it, and the curse curved around the shield and hit the chamber wall, and the stone didn't crack. It absorbed it, and Harry felt the castle take it and hold it. And the deep vibration in the floor was no longer passive. The castle was awake. He felt it wake the way you feel a very large thing that has been very still decide to stop being still, a shift in the fundamental quality of the space, the magic in the stones no longer ambient but active, not attacking, not defensive, just present and aware and pointed toward what was threatening one of its own. Voldemort felt it too. The wrong eyes went sharp and then, for the first time, uncertain. "What is the castle?" Harry said. "It's been here for 1,000 years. It knows what belongs here and what doesn't." He looked at the thing wearing Quirrell steadily. "You were never supposed to be here. You've been here on borrowed time since September, and the castle has been patient because I asked it to be." He stepped forward. "1 step. Easy. I'm done asking." The second spell came, and the third, rapid sequence, and Harry moved through them the way water moves through, not blocking, redirecting, the defense that wasn't a defense but a conversation with the spell's trajectory, asking it to go elsewhere, and it went elsewhere because he asked it clearly, and the magic in him that had never learned to be small understood asking in a way that Voldemort, who had never asked anything, could not process. He reached Quirrell in 5 steps. He put his hand on Quirrell's arm. The pain was extraordinary and mutual, Quirrell screaming, Harry's hand burning white-hot, the connection between them creating a feedback loop that was his mother's love and his mother's magic and something that had been coded into his skin since Halloween 1981. But Harry had been taught pain by someone who understood it and had been taught to sit in it rather than flinch away, and he held on, and the screaming was not his, and the burning was not breaking him, and Quirrell's arm beneath his hand was crumbling. He heard Hermione shout something behind him. He heard Ron hit the chamber wall trying to move forward and then Hermione pulling him back. He held on. Voldemort tore himself out of the Quirrell shape the way something tears out of anything that can no longer hold it, a wrenching separation, the cold signature suddenly free and directionless, the dark presence filling the chamber like smoke, and it hit Harry as it moved for the exit, hit him like cold water, and Harry felt it in every part of him and felt everything he was, the network, the warmth, the 7 years of being heard, and he let it all of that be present, let it fill him completely, and the cold thing hit all of that warmth and bounced. Bounced. Like cold water hitting a very warm stone. Not destroyed. Not vanquished. Not a dramatic final defeat. Just, unable to maintain cohesion in a space that was completely, wholly, saturatedly alive with everything Harry was. It fragmented. It dispersed. It went out the chamber ceiling like smoke going out a chimney and was gone. Quirrell's body collapsed. Harry stood with his burned hand and the castle still vibrating fully awake beneath him and the mirror of Eriste reflecting something he didn't look at. He kept his eyes from it deliberately, on the advice Miriam had given about mirrors that showed desires, which was look at them later when you're calm and ready, never in a moment of heat, and he turned to Hermione and Ron. They looked at him. He looked at them. Quirrell was still. "Are you all right?" Hermione said. "Yes," he said. His hand was badly burned. He'd need the medical kit from the dormitory. "Are you?" "Fine," Ron said, which was visibly not quite true because he'd hit the wall hard and would have a bruise from shoulder to hip tomorrow. Is he, gone?" Harry said. "Not permanently. Dispersed. He'll find another way to return. He always does." He looked at the collapsed Quirrell shape. "But not tonight." The chamber door opened. Dumbledore stood in the entrance. He looked at the chamber. At Quirrell. At the mirror. At Harry standing in the center of it all with his burned hand and his steady green eyes. He looked at all of it for a long moment and Harry looked back and whatever passed between them in that moment was more than a year's worth of accommodation and adjustment and two people deciding what they were to each other. Dumbledore crossed the chamber in 4 strides and took Harry's burned hand in both of his and looked at it and said, not grandly, not with the weight of prophecy or chosen one significance, just with the voice of a very old man who had nearly gotten things wrong in a very costly way, "I should have been here sooner." "It's all right," Harry said. "It isn't, quite. But we'll work on that." He looked at the hand. "Poppy will have you fixed in 20 minutes. Come." He led them out. Harry walked beside him through the corridor and felt the castle's magic settling back from active to ambient as they moved, the deep vibration gentling back to background hum. It had woken. It had done what it did. It was done now. At the corridor junction, before the staircase that led back to the normal castle, Harry felt the signal spike, from outside, from the grounds, from the forest perimeter. Rook's amber glow, blazing bright, the question it carried absolutely clear, "Do you need us?" He sent back. Not words. Just warmth, the specific warmth that meant we are all right. It is done. Thank you for being there. And the answer from every direction at once, from the forest and the mountains and the loch 100 miles north and the goblin vaults under London and Miriam in the Highland cottage who had been awake all night with the cottage's ward stones reading every spike and shift, the answer came back warm and immediate and overwhelming. "We heard you. We always hear you. We are here." The hospital wing was quiet at 2 in the morning. Madame Pomfrey dealt with Harry's hand with professional speed and significant disapproval of how it had gotten that way. Ron's shoulder was bruised but intact. Hermione had a small cut from the devil's snare chamber that was cleaned and closed in a minute. Dumbledore sat in the chair by Harry's bed while Pomfrey worked. He didn't speak. He was, Harry recognized, being present rather than managing, just sitting, just being in the same space, without an agenda in it. It was the most purely human he'd seemed. McGonagall arrived 10 minutes after them, in her dressing gown, which was a remarkable sight that Ron appeared to be filing for future reference. She looked at Harry and Ron and Hermione in 3 beds and then at Dumbledore and then at Harry again. "Well," she said. "Quirrell," Harry said. "Voldemort was using him. It's resolved for now." "For now," she repeated. "He'll return," Harry said. "Not soon. But he will." He met her eyes. "We'll be more prepared when he does." She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression she had for him that lived in the complicated territory between exasperated and something that wasn't exasperation at all. "Yes," she said. "I rather imagine you will be." She left Pomfrey to her work and went to find the appropriate administrative response to a professor's body in the 3rd-floor corridor, which was going to involve considerable paperwork and several challenging conversations, and Madame Pomfrey applied divinity to Harry's hand and told him to sleep, and Hermione was already asleep, and Ron was almost asleep but not quite. "Harry," Ron said, from the next bed. "Yes. That thing you did. The warmth thing. When it tried to go through you." He was quiet for a moment. "That was the network, wasn't it? All of them. That's what it bounced off." Harry thought about this. "Partly," he said. "And partly just, what I am. Who I am. I've been," he searched for how to say it, "I've been heard so consistently, for so long, that the part of me that was afraid and small and alone that night in the cupboard isn't the biggest part of me anymore. And whatever Voldemort is, whatever he does, it's predicated on people being alone with their fear." He looked at the ceiling. "I'm not alone with anything." Ron was quiet. "Neither are we," he said. "Me and Hermione. Not anymore." "No," Harry said. "Not anymore." Hermione made a small sound from the next bed that was either dreaming or agreement. "Probably both." Harry looked at the hospital wing ceiling and felt the network, all of it, warm and present and constant, and he felt the castle around him, old and solid and satisfied, and he felt Rook's amber glow in the forest, close now, and sable somewhere in the night sky above the grounds, and Miriam's sharp signature 100 miles north warming toward sleep now that the crisis was done. He felt Ragnarok in the deep Gringotts vaults, already writing the morning's documentation. He felt all of it. He pressed his unbandaged hand flat against the mattress and the castle pressed back, the way it always did, the way the ceiling of the cupboard had pressed back on a November night in 1984 when something ancient and enormous had finally heard a 4-year-old crying and had decided that was enough of that. In June, when the school year ended and the train carried students back to London, Harry stood on the platform at King's Cross with Hermione beside him reading a book and Ron beside her arguing with one of his brothers about something involving a purple firework, and Miriam was there, waiting at the barrier with her canvas jacket and her assessing eyes, and he walked toward her and she walked toward him and when they met she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and looked at him with everything in her expression that she always kept carefully managed. "How was it?" she said. "Complicated," he said. "Good. Complicated and good. That's usually what worth doing feels like," she said. He turned back to the platform. He caught Ron's eye and got the wave with the enormous grin. He caught Hermione's eye over her book and got the small smile that was Hermione's enormous grin, depending on your translation. He turned back to Miriam. "I want to go back next year," he said. "I know," she said. "And the year after. All of them. I know that too." She was looking at the platform, at the crowd, at the ordinary chaos of it. And this summer I want to go to the forest. I want to see Rook. I want to see Sable in the place where she lives instead of watching me from above." He paused. "And I want to come home." She looked at him. The Highland cottage with the loch and the kelpie and the bowtruckles and the morning mist. All of it waiting. It'll be there, she said. It's always there. They walked through the barrier together, back into the Muggle world's particular version of ordinary, and the barrier closed behind them, and the world on this side didn't know what lived on the other side of it, the Parliament in the forest, the pact spoken under October light, the ward stones and the legal fortresses and the Thestral on the roof in Surrey on a November night and a 4-year-old boy pressing his palm against the glass. Everything that had grown from that night. Everything that answered when the world was asked. Harry walked into the London afternoon with his hand healed and his school trunk on the trolley and the whole coalition warm around him from every direction, and he was 11 years old and unafraid and entirely, completely, unreservedly himself. The world had heard him. He had heard the world back. That was, he thought, exactly how it was supposed to work.